When one thinks of games nowadays, it is not uncommon to think of the myriad games that tell deep and serious stories. However, it wasn't always like that. So how did this one game change the gaming landscape? Until relatively recently, games used to, more often than not, be more on the over-the-top and unserious side, until one man decided to change that and redefine what video games could be. As is the norm, the marketing budget was crucial to the game's success. However, Gears of War was a special case. With there not being a new Halo to go along with the release of the 360, Xbox needed a platform seller. So their marketing was essentially Xbox 360 marketing, which led to Xbox bloating the absolute shit out of the marketing funding for Epic Studios. So much so, it was reported that Gears got a disproportionate amount of funding, even though a solid number was never given. However, the most recurring aspect of the marketing I found during my research was this one thing: the Mad World trailer. This trailer, according to literally every article I have found, has changed how video game trailers were made going forward. So let's take a look at what the trailer shows us. Full disclaimer, I heard this trailer causes a severe case of the copyright strikes, so if that has happened, you will only see stills from the trailer. Sorry in advance. The Mad World trailer follows Marcus Phoenix, the protagonist of the series, shown upside down in a puddle, which usually represents the meaning of something not being right due to the world being turned upside down. He touches the head of a statue and turns it, revealing the unblemished half of the broken head, looking for the brightness of the past while being steeped in the destruction of today. After seeing the enemy digging through the ground to reach him, Marcus runs through the desolate streets to get away, the camera always framing him in tight enclosed spaces, giving a sense of being cornered on all sides and being funneled toward a destination that he has no control over. Metaphorically speaking, it could also represent other feelings such as powerlessness or anxiety, which is reinforced by the dark lighting and the rain beating down on him. The next shot is framed as if he's being watched, which is quickly revealed to be true, as locusts are hiding in the shadows, waiting to pounce. At one point, Marcus is almost face to face with a locust drone, which is when he forces his way through a wall, breaking free of his predetermined path into a wide open space, but being forced with even more hardship, as represented by the huge fucking amount of locusts. At first, we see him defiantly staring down the locust horde, but the muzzle flash reveals his true feelings. A look of desperation and fear replaces his defiant expression. The trailer ends with a giant locust horde and Marcus in a wide shot that may represent the helplessness he feels going up against such an overwhelming force, with an endless abyss waiting behind them. All in all, the trailer gives off a more desperate fight for survival vibe that is not really present in the first game proper, but rather an undertone in the background. It portrayed a seriousness rarely found in games up until then, elevating games from being this enjoyable but ultimately silly hobby to feeling like an event that created a world and story in under 2 minutes that had people enraptured and digging into this trailer, craving for more. One of the most interesting things I learned while researching Gears for this video was learning that the Mad World trailer came rather late into development of Gears 1, and made the studio change the tone of the franchise after seeing how exceptionally well this trailer was received. It was clear that people had a craving for this dark, dreary and somber setting instead of the setting that Epic had already created. As it was far too late to uproot the entire game to match the theme wholly, they made sure to double down on it in future releases and doing what they can to represent it in this one. Cliff Bleszinski used different personal life experiences to mold the tone of the game, citing a failing relationship and a trip to London to be two major inspirations in the game's themes, visuals, and even enemy design. Be it the desperation of Marcus and Dom that fuels them, the ruined beauty of Sera now that the locusts have ravaged it, or the Berserker, which was meant to represent Cliff's former wife. Beyond real-life influences, Gears was also meant to be a flagship showcase for next-gen games, with Unreal 3 being specifically made for it, allowing for seamless loading and larger, more detailed environments. This major leap in tech also forced Xbox to double the RAM of the 360, being forced to do so after having been told by Epic that Gears would not run well if the RAM was not increased. Xbox, of course, did as they were told, as Gears of War not being a success was not an option. Makes you wonder if General Ram, being the final boss, was a joke by the team to allude to the RAM being the final issue that stood in their way to making this game as they wanted to, and that being to create one of the defining shooters of that era. When you think of 2000s and early 2010s shooters, what do you remember? Do you remember a poopy color palette with dystopian depictions of collapsed societies while being hunted by otherworldly creatures with that weird metallic sheen on everything that looks like someone cranked the reflections up to max while lathering the characters in especially reflective oil, and characters that range from gruff, sad military men to gruff, one-liner spitting military men? Well, then you'd be right. These settings had a comic book-esque silliness to them, as they took themselves so seriously that it went full circle to being comedic instead of being edgy. These games would also rarely throw anything resembling deep enemy characters in your way, and would rather opt for the over-the-top, crazy, or evil villains of the week type characters that only existed to aura farm for a few seconds before they got absolutely bodied by the player. They also managed to stave off their grim edginess by adding just enough creative additions to the setting, be it an alien virus that changed history, maddened residents of an oversized aquarium, or paranormal threats. Gears of War is very much a part of these early 2000s shooters. So with the preamble out of the way, how does the world of Gears look like? Gears of War is set on Sera, a planet much like ours, but different in so many ways. Sera's days are longer, the planet itself is bigger, and has a civilization that has known war on an unimaginable scale. Long before the events of the game, the Serans engaged in a war known as the Pendulum Wars, which was fought for the control over emulsion, a naturally occurring quote-unquote resource used to fuel quite literally everything. The discovery of emulsion caused two camps to form on Sera, the COG and the UIR. Their nearly century-long war was only ended due to the inability of both factions to continue it. This forced end to the war ushered in an age of peace and prosperity that lasted for only 1.5 months until the emergence of the Locust changed everything. The Locust Horde made use of the exhausted military force of Sera and managed to wipe out a fourth of all humans within a single day. This terrible event would even go on to change the way Serans would date their calendars, changing it to BE and AE. This global invasion forced humanity to retreat to a plateau that could not be dug through, and forced them to use their new superweapon, the Hammer of Dawn, on their own unevacuated cities, in the hopes of slowing down the Locust invasion even a slight bit. This brutal countermeasure failed to harm the Locust in any meaningful way, and after 14 years of further collapse, we pick up the fight in what may be the final stand of humanity as a whole, as it faces an assault of enormous size. The setting of Gears of War is a crumbling, war-torn world defined by a desperate attempt at survival, countless sacrifices, and the cost of endless conflict. Its destroyed beauty reflects a society clinging to remnants of civilization while facing extinction beneath the shadow of a relentless, subterranean enemy. Now, 14 years after E-Day arrived, Marcus Phoenix is freed from a cell by his old friend Dominique Santiago, due to all criminals having been pardoned to be drafted into service to aid the COG to counteract an offensive launched by the Locust Horde that has the COG on the back foot. After meeting up with Delta Squad, you set out to save what remains of an allied squad that had the Resonator with them, a device which is to be used to map out the subterranean tunnels of the Locust Horde known as the Hollow, so that it can be determined where a weapon called the Light Mass Bomb can be deployed to deal the most damage possible and possibly end the war. Here you meet Baird, a military scientist, and Cole, aka the main character of the franchise, no matter what the game may try to tell you. This mission takes you across the country through former residential areas where the stranded, the people who were left behind during the Hammer of Dawn strikes, now are hounded by tiny horrifying locusts that will shred you to bits if you dare to venture outside the safety of light, to the very hollow itself, encountering some of the biggest vermin the locusts have to offer. And if that summary of the story seems way too concise and short to you, that is mainly because it genuinely is that way in the story. I actually have to bring this up. Gears of War 1 feels like it was written like the final act of the story. All the characters feel like they have a sense of purpose already and don't have to find themselves. They know what their duty is and don't have to go through the hero's journey anymore because they have already arrived at the descending action. But at the same time, it still guides you along as if you were new to all this, by not expositing all over you with complicated subject matter, but rather dropping the odd line about some random topic like it was the most normal thing in the world and then moving on, allowing you to fill in the blanks if you want to. This is a thing that I really appreciate in shooters from that time frame. Hinting at a wider world by not trying to make it seem like a new world at all, but instead like it was common knowledge. Sure, that comes with its issues, what with the story having barely anything to hold on to while you go through it, as the wider setting is never really explained, which in turn makes the offhand remarks by in-game characters such as this one.
Can we please just leave?
No, we've got work to do.
Please! If we stay here, they'll kill us for sure.
Relax, will ya?
You relax. You Gears all suck. Bunch of bloodthirsty fascist pigs.
All the more intriguing. Is he just a nutjob who is mad that they won't escort him out of there, or is there genuinely more to it? Well, by the time I read that question, you totally asked yourself, he died, so now you don't get the answer either way.
Dipshit.
Or what about this scene earlier in the game where you meet the stranded? They all hide or arm themselves at the sight of you, which is not quite the reaction one would expect to the heroes of the story. These little crumbs just add a feeling to the game I cannot quite describe, but want more of. These are crumbs that are picked up again in the sequels, which again poses a problem. Gears of War can be seen as a game that cleverly builds a wider universe by merely hinting at one, or it can be seen as the Marvel Phase 4 of video games. Constant setup with none of the payoff. I personally think it is the former, but I have seen people describe it to be more of a setup game that relies more on its gameplay to hook the player rather than giving any proper thought to the story or the characters for that matter. Though, there I have to interject and say, while this game is not character driven at all, you get slivers of the personalities of the ones you journey with. Sure, Baird may sound like an absolute jackass, but you also get these slivers of him feeling somewhat flustered about having been caught absolutely losing himself in some sort of engineering topic, or Dom being this lighthearted buddy who then suddenly becomes really serious when it comes to defending Marcus' innocence. These inklings of deeper characters would later then be picked up by the sequels and turn these quippy, one-liner spouting macho men into genuinely deep characters with facets to their beings that still spouted one-liners.
Giant worm! They're sinking cities with a giant worm!
So, with the characters and story not being the main thing for Gears 1, what did the people come to this game for? As mentioned before, the gameplay of Gears of War is truly the thing that sells it. I played both the original 360 version of the game, and once I had heard there was a PC version of it available via Game Pass, I swapped over to that, and one would expect the gameplay to feel dated in the 360 version compared to the updated PC version. And I am shocked to say that it felt no different at all. Oh, and before we get into the gameplay proper, I have to complain about Game Pass. Why is there no language change option? Why is it tied to my goddamn system language? And how come even then it doesn't work properly? I don't want to listen to the shitty German excuse of a voiceover. I want the English voiceovers. Jesus Christ! The one way I could describe the gameplay of Gears is heavy. Whereas many other shooters back then, and even now, focus on gameplay and movement being snappy and responsive, Gears of War focused on the weight of it. If you look at these characters, what do you see? Do you see people that could float like a butterfly and sting like a bee? If so, you need to get some glasses, my friend, because you may be a berserker. No, these supersized dwarfs boast a girth that at best allows them to move like an obese tank with anger issues and a grumpy attitude to boot. And speaking of boots, as the chunkiest ballerinas around, you obviously are a huge target, which forces you to rush to cover, and when you do, you can feel each goddamn gram of meat on these hulking soldiers. The cover shooter gameplay was inspired by Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera and Kill Switch's sticky cover, but polished to such a degree that most people would claim that Gears of War would be the defining cover shooter. You don't run and gun, you duck and fire, with an action camera following you all the way, recording everything as if you were in a war documentary, camera shake included. While the guns didn't kick like a mule, forcing you to adjust your aim while firing, they spray into oblivion if you didn't get into position and brace your guns. It makes the combat not feel like you're fighting an anonymous enemy that is so far away you cannot see their faces. Every gun makes sure you see the face of your enemy by either forcing you to be up close or allowing you to zoom in and see the ugly mug that is trying to take you out. In that, the combat feels more like a gladiator fight you cannot run from, but have to be face to face with your enemy to survive. This intimate situation you will find yourself in time and time again allows you to also hear the symphony of the armory present in Gears 1. For every gun you pick up sounds like it is being fired right next to your ear and has a sound that may just be unique in the entire shooter genre. That is, unless you decide to whip out Old Reliable and cut yourself some prime locust meat. Gears of War was received with overwhelmingly positive reviews and quickly became one of the defining titles of the Xbox 360 era. It was praised for its technical leaps, modernized presentation, and a refreshing and responsive gameplay. Gaming outlets praised its environment and combat design, even going so far as to say that it redefined what a shooter could be. It went on to win way too many awards to list, but chief among them were Best Shooter and Best Graphics, forcing everyone to acknowledge that this newcomer to the landscape was here to stay, and changed the perception that shooters were always over the top and could not tell more serious stories. Aside from critical acclaim, Gears was also a moneymaker, being one of the fastest selling games of the 360 and spiking Xbox Live subscriptions. Gears, of course, became the first in a long list of official media that would build on the franchise and expand its world with 8 games, with a 9th on the way, 8 books, 3 comics, a board game, and a Gears of War film that has been stuck in development hell since 2016. The original trilogy kept the ball rolling with hit after hit, but with the release of the new gen games, namely Gears 4 and 5, the ball stopped, with 4 having received some major criticisms in its writing and 5 with its lack of innovation. As someone who has been interested in Gears for a long time, and with Gears of War E-Day coming out in 2026, I finally took the plunge into the setting, and after having finished the first game, I am genuinely hungry for more and cannot wait to dive deeper into this world. There was a time when the shooter genre felt like it had reached its peak. A time when Gears of War 1 emerged onto the gaming scene like the locust on E-Day, rocking the industry to its core and changing how shooters would be viewed from here on out. How could Epic Studios possibly top something that already stood on what seemed like an unreachable plateau? The answer was failure. Gears of War 2 would fail you, and in doing so, become something even greater. Unlike the first game, which was largely seen as a risk by the higher-ups at Microsoft due to its, for the time, gratuitous amounts of gore, its sequel was met with a very different reaction. one of excitement. This confidence inspired Xbox to use a bold marketing strategy, using the Xbox itself as the stage on which they would build their audience and their hype. Their boldness to bring the marketing to the customer was shown during GDC 2008, where, alongside the reveal of the sequel, they would release a teaser trailer via the Xbox Marketplace showing off the new chainsaw dueling mechanic. This approach was complemented by interviews with various printed media all the way up until the release of Gears 2, even though online blogs have already been a thing for a while at this point and would have definitely granted them a wider, more global audience. This was because Cliff Bleszinski believed that online blogs could be safely ignored, as it was their job to pick up the hottest news from printed media and publish it online, making it essentially free press for the game. Over the next few months, Microsoft would position Gears of War 2 as their big ticket item and treat it like the equivalent of a summer blockbuster movie, but for games. During the 2008 E3 presentation, Gears 2 would be their centerpiece and showed off a new trailer, Rendezvous with Death, which depicted a battle scene in the Hollow and hinting at something going on with Dom, new images, footage, and a hands-on demo for those in attendance, and later a global demo. This presentation was meant to show off their design strategy of making everything bigger, better, and more badass. To hammer this home, Epic Studios revealed a limited edition version of the game that would contain a different cover art, a steelbook, a DVD with some behind-the-scenes footage, a concept art book, a replica of Dom's and Maria's photo, some story details, and a gold camo for the Lancer in PvP. And if you got the limited edition at Best Buy, you would even get a remote-controlled Centaur tank replica. All of that for just $10 extra. The modern gaming industry could never. Though while all of that was rather impressive for the time, the team was not done yet. They wanted their potential audience to truly get invested, and so they began their Last Day ARG campaign, in which around 1,000 bloggers and other big names in gaming media would be sent big, meaty cogs, and several more cogs being hidden in cities across the world with codes on them. Finding all cogs and all pieces of the code would unlock a website which would reveal more videos, images, audios, and story beats prior to the release. The team believed that, and I quote, "If they're rabid enough, and even if they hate each other, communities will come together," unquote, to create an unforgettable event that would stick with the community for a long time. With these strategies, the hype for the game rose and rose until it reached a fever pitch on the emergence day of Gears 2. Nowadays, midnight launches aren't really that special anymore since the industry has shifted toward digital releases over physical ones, but back then, release day was a massive event. It was basically a mini version of those chaotic American Black Friday sales videos you can find on YouTube, where everybody's just going insane. Epic Studios really wanted to reward those dedicated enough to show up at midnight. Attendees were given codes for a gold camo hammer burst in PvP, and while that was neat, it wasn't what made the night truly memorable. What made the release night unforgettable was the presence of the devs and the voice actors. People like Cliff Bleszinski, Rod Ferguson, and writer Josh Ortega showed up, along with voice actors like John DiMaggio and Carlos Ferro. I'm very sorry if I butchered those names. They gave out merch, autographs, live interaction, the whole shebang. Gears 2 even made noise outside of the gaming space. There was this absolutely hysterical article from the New Yorker in 2008 that pointed out how games like Gears of War don't have things like scores, health bars, and lives, and that heading right on screen wasn't the only direction anymore, showing that gamers were in such a niche that the average Joe would never hear of the gigantic leaps in technology that were happening in the gaming space. It's absolutely adorable. With the exceptional reception of Gears 1, selling over 5 million units in its first year, it was clear to Cliff Bleszinski that a sequel was all but guaranteed. So, Epic began work on Gears 2 almost immediately after shipping the first game. In an interview, Cliff revealed that they wanted to hone in more on the overarching story and dark tone for the sequel, making sure it permeated every aspect of the game. Gears 2 was seen as a project that had to add flourish to an already great, if a little drab, base. And with a fixed release date looming, development had to change across the board. One of the first major changes was getting a special envoy to directly relay needs between Epic and Microsoft, cutting through the usual bureaucracy to get something approved or changed. This helped a lot, especially since they adopted a best idea wins mentality, meaning that if a new idea beat out a current one, they would just adjust everything to make that idea work. One example was executions. During the playtest, Cliff asked why he couldn't just stomp a downed locust. Everyone in that room agreed that was weird, and just like that, executions were born. These ideas didn't just come from the staff either. Epic kept an eye on online forums and implemented fan feedback when possible, always trying to balance what players wanted with their own vision. Epic wasn't just working off of spur-of-the-moment ideas. Instead, at the beginning of development, in response to the set timeframe, they made a list of 35 things to make bigger, better, or simply to add more of. I could only dig up a few of these in my research, like the party system, bots, netcode optimization, improved ease of play, and a stronger focus on getting the plot across clearly. As the party system and bots are pretty self-explanatory, let's jump to ease of play. According to Cliff and Rod Ferguson, who had joined Epic as producer shortly before Gears 1 launched, they took in a lot of feedback on how the gameplay felt. One major gripe was how running, dodging, and taking cover were all tied to the same button, which sometimes made the player get snagged on cover when they were just trying to dodge or keep running. In Gears 2, they let players separate those inputs, though I didn't know that was a thing, so I was still doing it the old way like a dumbass. Well, that would have been great to know at the beginning somehow. Another big piece of feedback was that Gears 1 was too hard and didn't have enough schmeat on its bones, so Gears 2 came with more difficulty options, dynamic difficulty for co-op, and an overall longer campaign. And since we're already on the topic of the campaign, in my previous video I mentioned how the game's plot was so exceedingly straightforward, I managed to cram it into a 1-minute summary. That will not be the case this time, trust me. That straightforwardness made the story feel shallow in the eyes of Epic and gamers, so they decided to flip the script and make something so dense, so ever-present, that unlike last time, where my notes fit on half a page, this time they took up 6 goddamn pages. Talk about compensating. This absolute heel turn from a plot as non-existent as Marcus's neck to an actually deep story that takes itself seriously required someone who could both expand the lore and push the emotional weight to the forefront. That someone was the previously mentioned Joshua Ortega. Brought on as lead writer, Ortega worked closely with Cliff and Rod Ferguson to handle the full script and steer the game's tone. His focus? Show the horror of war, not just through destruction, but through personal tragedy. The gut punch of Dom's and Maria's fate? That emotional roller coaster? That was all Ortega. And to make sure players actually got the story this time, the team also decided on repeating objectives by cutting up a large objective into multiple smaller ones that would repeat the overarching objective as the end goal, driving home key plot points through gameplay structure. And as you can tell with how often I said objective in this one paragraph, you probably know this paragraph is about the objectives. Hey there everyone, this is Hawks from the future, and I'm just butting in here real quick to make a small announcement. We have channel memberships now. There's only one tier for 2 whole schmeckles. I know, quite a lot, but it gets you some neat bird-themed badges and emotes. And aside from that, if you do decide to grant upon me your hard-earned doubloons, you will also get my videos a week early, and you will also be shouted out at the end of each and every video. However, if you don't want to get a membership, that is all good too. Your viewership is quite enough for me and always appreciated more than you could possibly think. Alright, I'll leave you to the video again now. Ortega's approach to the story also reshaped the characters. Dom was made the player's surrogate, allowing Marcus to remain a blank slate. That way, if the plot required a choice the player might not agree with, it wouldn't taint the way we see Marcus. It would fall on Dom, who took on all the questions, rash decisions, and emotional outbursts. Marcus, by contrast, was meant to be the rock and, crucially, the lens through which the player saw the world. The one who always knew, or at least seemed to know, what to do next. Together, they formed one complete character. Dom as the voice and the emotions of the player, and Marcus as the hand and the eyes of the player. And speaking of what the player sees, what do you picture when you think about the first game? The train at the end with the dark brown skies streaked with black? Or do you see the grey pillars? Because that's what I see. I see the grey pillars. Apparently, that's what most people remembered Gears 1 for.
It's you! It's you! How could you, man?
Even Cliff found this disappointing, citing criticism that it was dull. And that criticism isn't entirely unwarranted. Even in the Ultimate Edition. Sure, there's some greenery, but it's mostly browns and greys. The devs agreed with that sentiment, and looking at Gears 2, things definitely got brighter. You can see the hollow lit up in various blues, Emulsion Lakes casting caves in yellow, the inside of the Alaskan bullworm throbbing with pinks and reds, and the Queen's Palace filled with golds, oranges, and greens, I think. And to show that the game was no longer designed to look like solidified shit and concrete, it was deemed that Gears 2 should have vista moments. Moments in which the set pieces, the areas, the world itself could be displayed in a way that allowed the player to gawk at it for a while before getting back into the action. One of the biggest examples here would be the initial offensive with the hillbilly truckers, showing off a vast battlefield with tons of enemies next to a lush green forest under a clear blue sky with a wide field of view. But this brought up an issue: believability. On such massive battlefields, infantry wouldn't normally just use weapons like the Lancer, shotguns, or snipers. Sure, they would, but those are guns made for smaller skirmishes. No way in hell the COG or Locust didn't also come up with weapons made to wipe out larger hordes in these kinds of situations. So the team developed new weapons that would logically fit into these large-scale encounters: the Mulcher and the Mortar. Sadly, Unreal Engine 3 as it existed wasn't built to fully bring all of this to life. So, Epic created Unreal Engine 3. Well, not really, they upgraded UE3, but you get what I mean. Allowing for more actors on screen, meaning more enemies, characters and stuff, better lighting, destructible environments, to a degree, improved water rendering, upgraded development tools, and physics-based tree movements. Wait. Is that not the same pitch Anthem used?
You can see the trees being blown over and stuff like that. I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
Was Anthem really trying to score points with something that Gears 2 already did? What the fuck? These changes let the team amp up player interaction, using Locust's meat shields, chipping away cover, and improving in-game models while using fewer polygons, which definitively would have helped out the 3D artists, as some characters would take up to 6 weeks to fully create. And a last little fact before we move on: Gears of War was originally envisioned as more of a Battlefield style game before evolving into the tight cover-based shooter we know today. Though the only thing that Gears has in common with Battlefield are the multiplayer modes. Gears of War 2 features the already known modes from its predecessor: single player story, co-op story, and PvP. But this time around, Gears has a new addition, something that would hopefully not make you want to rage as much, or make you rage even more depending on what you were looking for: Horde mode. Out of these modes, I specifically want to highlight two: co-op and Horde mode. Co-op was made to be a sort of onboarding system for new gamers to get into gaming proper in a fun and very involved way. Not only would they have the troubles of playing a game for the first time, but they would have those troubles together with someone else, turning the initial frustration and confusion into memorable or funny moments that you and whoever you were with will remember for ages. And it made the absolutely revolutionary decision to individualize the difficulty for each player. Meaning, if your newbie buddy wanted to play on easy, the game would adjust the stats of that buddy and the enemies accordingly. However, if you chose the hardest difficulty because you were an absolute gamer, the game would individually adjust the stats in your instance of the game to be much more unforgiving, allowing for both of you to have fun in your own way. In 2008, why did we not adopt this in every game since? How is this not the norm? Holy shit! On the other side of the spectrum is the Horde mode. Unlike the co-op story mode, Horde mode was meant to actually not be beaten, or rather meant to not be beaten without trying your asses off. It was meant to emulate the feeling of going to the arcade. Never truly beating the game, but always trying to get further and further, only to be brutally beaten down again and again, chasing ever higher scores. I would talk about PvP and how popular it is, but I personally didn't find anything too interesting to talk about, aside from, yeah, it was solid. But was it as solid as the story? The story this time around is so dense, it is somewhat insane to see how it went from essentially an action flick to this deep action drama, and because of that, there's a little more to talk about, especially the theme of failure, which will become very apparent very fast. A few months after the end of Gears 1 and the light mass bomb destroying the Hollow, Gears 2 picks up with the revelation that what was destroyed was not actually the entire Hollow, but just a section known as the Outer Hollow, meaning the bomb may have done some damage to the Locust forces, but not even close to what the COG had hoped for. Here we meet some familiar faces in the form of Marcus, Dom, and the Walking Death flag. Due to as of yet unknown circumstances, the Locust attack has been more aggressive than ever before, now assaulting the Jacinto Plateau directly. After meeting up with yet another COG soldier, Ty Caliso, your team pushes back the assault of the Locust, and you are informed that Anya may have further information on the whereabouts of Dom's wife, who has been missing for over 13 years. This lead, sadly, goes cold, causing Dom to crash out. Following the successful defense against the Locust, the COG leader initiates a counteroffensive to take the fight underground, as reports warn that the Grubs are now capable of sinking entire cities. King Ravens, hundreds of infantry, and some painfully stereotypical truckers roll out in massive trucks, but things don't go as planned due to a brutal counteroffensive launched by the Locust. Marcus and Dom push through the chaos and board a grind lift when they witness Ty being held up by a special Locust named Scourge, who easily destroyed a COG tank and will surely have an equally threatening boss fight. In the Hollow, the COG forces become scattered across different skirmishes until they stumble upon the Locust's secret weapon, a massive, ancient creature known as the Alaskan Bull Riftworm. After surviving an ambush with the help of the series' true main character, the Coal Train, and reuniting with Baird, the squad attempts to return to the surface. While doing so, they come across a torture barge and find Ty alive, but severely maimed. Though they free him, he takes his own life with a shotgun, traumatized beyond repair after just a few hours in captivity and torture. Shortly after recovering from the shock of an old friend's and respected war hero's suicide, the team presses on. While evacuating, they're swallowed by the worm, forced to fight through it and perform open-heart surgeries that kill it because they use ChatGPT to write their thesis. Assholes. After being birthed by the worm's corpse, the squad is sent to the New Hope facility to track down the location of the Locust HQ. There they uncover logs documenting heinous experiments performed on the children of miners infected with emulsion. These twisted experiments led to the creation of the Sires, monstrous creatures that seem to be the missing link between Locust and humans. Among these logs, the team also finds the location of Locust HQ, quickly traveling there to prepare an assault to bring the fight to the Locust. Here they find a group of Stranded who point them towards the Nexus and the potential location of Maria. Once in the stronghold, Dom and Marcus find Maria, much to Dom's relief. Maria first appears to be uncannily okay. So well, in fact, it is no surprise that what we have seen was just Dom's delusion. Maria, in reality, is horribly scarred, malnourished, blind, and most likely lobotomized. Seeing her in this state makes Dom completely break down, even though, deep down, he knows what must be done. Dom says his final goodbyes to Maria and shoots her. A neat potential detail to point out here is that Marcus may actually be listening for a second gunshot, since he stops moving and looks back due to his past experience with Ty's death. From here on out, it is simply all-out war. The team storms the Locust Queen's palace, find out that the Locusts are having a civil war with glowing Locusts, call in the troops, and battle Scourge, the Locust priest that controlled the Riftworm. The team finds out that the Locusts are trying to collapse the Jacinto Plateau to both defeat humanity once and for all, and also flood a giant emulsion reservoir underneath the plateau. They decide that sinking the plateau is a good idea actually, but want to do so before the Locusts can evacuate. They hijack a Brumac to destroy the pillars holding up the granite plateau, but it gets infected with emulsion and goes fully lambent, which they exploit to blow up Jacinto and ride off into the sunset. This is where the story ends, but an ending narration by Queen Mira hints at a foreboding fate that is yet to come to the fore, and a post-credits scene, eat your heart out Marvel, which reveals that Adam Phoenix is still alive and is not happy with our shenanigans on Jacinto. As we previously learned in the video that you can watch by clicking on the top right now, Sera, the world where Gears of War takes place, is a planet torn apart by war. In this grim, ruined world, humanity fights for survival against an overwhelming threat from below, forcing the survivors into a desperate offensive against the encroaching darkness. This offensive dealt major damage to the Horde by wiping out the Krill, making the night safer, and incinerating troops in the Outer Hollow. And that is where the setting last left off. Though this may have seemed like a victory, it turned out to merely be the opening act of an impending catastrophe. If you've reached this point in the video, you may have picked up on a theme that permeates the entire story and even the multiplayer design strategy: failure. This game is meant to fail you. It makes you fail so you can desire to fight on and try again. Between Gears 1 and 2, the Serans have deteriorated badly. Their last refuge, the Jacinto Plateau, is under heavier attack than ever, straining resources and pushing the COG to become more authoritarian, conscripting civilians, bribing the stranded with protection for their families if they sign up, and lying to diseased soldiers that they'll recover just so they can shove them back into battle. No longer are they stopping a bigger assault. They poked the Wasp's nest with a nuke, which the fucking Wasps survived, and now they're coming for everything the Serans held dear. Gears 2 takes the victory of the first game and reframes it as a hollow victory. Meanwhile, the Locusts are revealed to be anything but mindless. They have their own culture, their own religion, and way more organization than we ever imagined. No longer simply killing Serans, but abducting them, enslaving them, and torturing them, either for stress relief or twisted information gathering. Their new aggression has a reason, hinted at all the way back in Gears 1. Something's wrong with the emulsion. In the first game, we saw glowing wretches, but no one knew what that meant. Now in Gears 2, the Locusts go all in with this assault because the lambency can't be contained anymore. It's breaking out, infecting them, and sparking a civil war they're actually losing. This game doesn't just show the failure of the light mass offensive, but personal failures too. Marcus missing the signs with Ty until it was too late, Dom arriving just a week too late to save Maria after searching for her for 13 years, and the COG's failures, such as covering up Rustlung, experimenting on children, and failing to fend off the Locust. And while these external threats rise, the writers decided the stakes still weren't high enough. A people at war for nearly a century changes fundamentally. War stops being an anomaly and becomes their identity. War becomes their home, their modus operandi, their new normal. The Serans worship war, celebrating new offensives, praising heroes, eagerly joining the fight. But the writers remind us that if you worship war, you owe it tribute, and it has come to collect. The game hints at even darker secrets. People are shown suffering from rust lung, a pneumonia-like disease with a deadlier, murkier origin, likely from the Lightmass offensive. Then there's the New Hope facility, where sires, horrific results of human experimentation, were created, hinted at through lore about child experimentation, outbreaks, and staff murders. But the game leaves those breadcrumbs for you to piece together. And this theme of failure, it isn't just in the story, it's baked into the gameplay itself. Horde mode is designed to push you and your friends to the brink. It wants you to lose so a win feels truly earned. And PvP, well, okay, I don't think I need to explain how failure is built right into that experience. It keeps you coming back again and again and again, just as if you were in an arcade where the games were just hard enough to not let you reach the desired goal. Just like its predecessor, Gears of War 2 was a massive success, earning critical acclaim thanks to Epic Studios truly delivering on their bigger, better, and more badass promise. Critics loved it, fans went nuts, and Xbox Live servers lit up like it was New Year's Eve. Reviewers praised its explosive visuals, refined cover-based shooting, and the emotional weight the story dared to dip its toes into, all while staying true to that over-the-top war movie energy that made the first one stand out. It was basically just more Gears of War, but louder, bolder, and with more enemies to chainsaw. The campaign was widely considered to be better than any shooter had the right to, and the game walked away with awards in all the usual categories, chief among them Best Shooter, Best Co-op, and Best Graphics. This proved that Epic didn't just catch lightning in a bottle. No, this proved they knew what they had was special and understood how to improve on it in all the areas that mattered. Gears 2 cemented the franchise as one of the defining heavy hitters of Xbox. And of course, it sold like crazy. Over 2 million copies were bought in the first weekend alone, making it one of the fastest selling games on the Xbox 360 at the time. By the end of its first year, it had passed the 5 million units sold mark, and once again helped spike Xbox Live subscriptions with its multiplayer modes. However, not everything was perfect. The PvP mode had a rough launch with matchmaking issues, weird balance problems, and shotgun mechanics that felt kind of off. But Horde mode was a different story. It was an instant hit and became a mainstay of the series going forward, allowing players to test their skills against waves of punishingly unrelenting foes. Now, having played the first 2 games and having nothing but positive words to say about them, I cannot wait to see how the trilogy concludes. Was the ending of the original Gears of War trilogy truly worth it? That's a question that's been rattling around in my head ever since the credits of Gears of War 3 rolled and I looked ahead to its sequels. With 2 back-to-back mega hits, Epic Games was riding high, counting among the most successful developers of that era. But, like all great things, Gears also had to come to an end. Gears of War 1 famously changed the gaming landscape, proving that shooters could be more than over-the-top action flicks. Gears 2 took that success and dialed everything up to 11, not only delivering a deeper, more emotionally driven story, but also shattering every multiplayer record on Xbox at the time. With accolades like these, the pressure was on Gears of War 3 to deliver an ending truly worthy of its predecessors. But was that the right decision? Was it really time to end the story of Marcus Phoenix and pass the torch to others? As we all know, marketing strategies are meticulously planned over weeks and months, with specific release dates and platforms being of utmost importance. To start off this final entry of the series, things did not go as planned. This happened via the Xbox dashboard, where an ad revealed Gears of War 3 prior to the official reveal, which was to come later. Down the line, when Cliff Bleszinski, lead designer for Gears of War 3, was asked how the leak affected marketing, he simply stated that shit happens, and that the leak actually managed to get more eyes from the mainstream audience on the game, which he appreciated. The actual reveal of the game was planned for, and I cannot believe this was a thing, a talk show appearance with Jimmy Fallon. In this official reveal, Cliff Bleszinski showed off a trailer called Ashes to Ashes, which depicted a three-way battle between the remnants of the Cog, the Locust, and the newly introduced enemy faction. Extremely angry, screaming rubber chickens. Here, they showcased the game's opening through a hands-on demo that Jimmy Fallon played live, and it was revealed that Drake, yes, that Drake, was going to voice Jace Stratton. This was later changed to Michael B. Jordan due to scheduling conflicts. But man, if Drake had actually gotten the part, this first scene would have aged really poorly.
Alright, give me a second. Damn, nearly got it that time.
That candy's like 10 years old, man. You're gonna puke your guts up.
Yeah, well, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
As great as the exposure from appearing on Jimmy Fallon may have been, especially in the early 2010s when mainstream media could still attract an uncountable number of viewers, those viewers may not have been the intended target audience. To that end, Chris Perna made a piece of cover art for an edition of Game Informer meant to show off key themes, story elements, and the overall tone of the final entry in the series. To make sure the issue stood out, the team set the cover in an unfamiliar and dangerous looking area. That's right, America, a Lambent-based zone meant to highlight the new enemy faction, with dead locusts at their feet to show the danger they posed. They also included a callback to Gears of War 1, by having the surrounding area be destroyed by Lambent stalks, harkening back to the destroyed beauty that was such a central theme in the game that started it all. And then he plopped down the characters. Yeah, I don't know what else to add here, that was pretty much it. On this cover, the characters wear stripped down armor to convey loss, hardship, and decay. One of the major key details is Marcus not looking at his enemies, but at the viewer, as once folded, the Lambent threat sat on the backside of the magazine, hidden until he looked closer, symbolizing how the Lambency had been lurking since the very beginning, only revealed once the Serans, and the audience, finally decided to look deeper. However, even in 2010, you couldn't expect gamers to go out and buy magazines. Look at these guys assuming gamers can read. After all, this wasn't the early 2000s where digital media could simply be ignored as with the first game. By the 2010s, online marketing was an effective and cheap way to get your product to the customer. And since the customer here was a bunch of gamers, what better way to get people interested than to create a PvP scenario that would affect the game's plot and aid a good cause? The Fate of Carmine charity event allowed people to buy one of two shirts for their Xbox Live avatars. One that stated "Save Carmine" and another that stated "Carmine must die." Buying either one would give that respective sentiment an extra point and would, by the end of development, decide the ultimate fate of Clayton Carmine, the third and final brother of the Carmine family, as no matter what the result would be, this was the end of the road for him. The same existed as an IRL promotion in which actual versions of the shirts were available too, and buying them would yield the same result. That money, regardless of the source, would be donated to the Child's Play charity, which would use the money to buy toys for children in hospitals and help fund those very same hospitals. The goal of the charity was to show that gaming and gamers were more than just video game addicts and something that would detract from a person's life. The campaign actually ended up raising $150,000, and the verdict was that the players had to play the game to find out what would happen to Clayton Carmine. Regardless of the outcome of this event, both outcomes of his fate were actually fully animated. That's nice, right? A nice and calm campaign that does some good in the world. So, how about following it up by strategically blowing up a wall so that it creates a mural? Huh. Well, I couldn't find images of said mural, but apparently it exists. It was far easier to find proof of their E3 appearance, in which Ice-T appeared alongside Cliffy B to show off new co-op gameplay, and then perform live during a brief glimpse at the new and improved Horde mode. This live performance gave the game even more buzz, as a well-known artist was now directly involved with the project, and even made a special track for the game's OST. Not long after, people got their first proper look at the new Horde mode, through the Dust to Dust trailer. The reveal itself was more grounded and almost felt like a fan edit rather than a polished, flashy trailer. It showed off the new features of Horde 2.0, like building defensive structures and managing a new in-game economy, clear signs of how much the mode had evolved since its original debut. But we will get to Horde mode later. Some other smaller campaigns included decoding hidden messages for real-life rewards and 2 custom-made Gears of War themed trikes which were revealed at SDCC 2011, one of which was then raffled away to a lucky winner at a Best Buy giveaway. However, one of the most targeted marketing campaigns was their Brothers to the End campaign, which aimed to capture a sliver of what the final game was about and use that to gain new fans in a very specific way. This campaign was a bit hard to figure out since I only found one article about it, so bear with me if I get something wrong. See, the team wanted to poach players from other shooters of the time, but it was difficult to get fans of industry juggernauts to even consider other games. To get a foot in the door, they made use of one of the most effective ways to get things done in a friend group: peer pressure. They wanted an existing Gears fan to team up with a non-Gears fan and go to Facebook to quote-unquote detonate wall murals that unlocked extra content for the game. Much to their surprise, this worked exceptionally well, garnering over 1.7 million interactions on Facebook. Whether this resulted in tons of new fans, I couldn't really find out, but judging by the sales numbers, which we'll get to later, they sure as hell did something right. Epic didn't stop there though. They found ways to make even their beta feel like part of the hype machine. Players who bought the special edition of Bulletstorm were guaranteed early access to the Gears 3 beta in April 2011, while others could get in by pre-ordering through GameStop. The beta itself evolved over time as well, adding new multiplayer modes based on community votes on Facebook and rewarding players with cosmetics to use in the full game. And speaking of pre-orders, there were plenty of ways to spend your money. 4 separate editions were announced. The Standard Edition, the Limited Edition which came with a box containing a COG metal replica, an Adam Phoenix character skin, a COG flag, and other in-universe mementos from Adam Phoenix, the Epic Edition, which included a Marcus statue, a behind-the-scenes book full of interviews, photos and concept art, plus a multiplayer skin pack, and the limited Xbox 360 edition, a Crimson Omen themed console that made Gears themed noises, along with matching controllers, the game, a headset, and 2 codes for in-game cosmetics. Pre-ordering from specific stores like Best Buy or GameStop also rewarded people with exclusive character skins like the Savage Cantus or Mechanic Baird. Across all these editions, the game managed to pull in 1.3 million pre-orders, a franchise record, and to keep that momentum going, the beta rewarded players with in-game skins and other unlockables for the full release. Epic still wasn't done though. Gears of War 3 went all in with the first ever live TV ads for a video game, a 6-part campaign that was said to be on the same level as their massive Halo marketing pushes for Reach and 3. A series I truly and honestly believe is nowhere near as good as Gears of War. Finally, Xbox gave the series the attention it truly deserved. And while the TV ad campaign was heretofore unheard of for video games, what they did next was genuinely insane. I kept this for last because once you hear this and compare it to ads in the modern day, yeah, companies were just built different back then. So they ran this ARG that had people digging through trailers, audio files, and even Craigslist meat listings, like actual slabs of meat advertised to be locust meat, to find hidden codes pointing to specific real-world locations. If you followed the clues, you'd end up at an actual butcher shop where you could claim a pound of locust flesh and get exclusive invites to launch party play sessions. And you want to know why they did that? Not because it was a cool way to say let's butcher these grubs. Well, okay, that was part of it too, but it was mainly because they suddenly had an extra year without any idea on what to do with that extra development time. Epic began development on Gears of War 3 right after shipping Gears 2, planning for a 2-year development cycle, as Microsoft wanted Bungie's and Epic's next games to launch one after another. With this time limit set, Epic Studios set out to make Gears 3 the most polished game in the original trilogy to make up for the various complaints of issues people experienced in Gears 2. Karen Travis, a former journalist and novelist who had already written the first novel, Asphalt Fields, was brought on to write the story this time around. The goal of her involvement was to bring more emotional realism to the universe and connect new ideas with old ones from both the games and novels. Travis didn't start by playing the games, however. Her work started with a cold read of what the community felt about the stories to better connect to those feelings in her writing. Using what she had learned from drudging through countless forum posts, she centered the story around the themes people cared most about, even going so far as to change details of the lore that didn't add up. A key point that she had to think about was that writing for a game meant thinking about how the relationship the audience had with the medium was different compared to an audience of book readers. Players could, for instance, skip cutscenes or miss dialogue entirely, which, if you ever watched a talkative YouTuber, couldn't be more true. So she kept things flexible, staying clear of heavy-handed exposition and instead letting small hints and moments slowly piece together the bigger picture by the end. The dev team also opted to rely a bit more on environmental storytelling rather than having to spell everything out via cutscenes, as seen in the very beginning of the game, where one cog tells another cog not to write on the Sudoku puzzle itself, as it would ruin it for the next person, which let us know that entertainment in these times is not only hard to come by, but also a scarce commodity that needed to be reused, or the deck of the carrier they are on being primarily used for farming, really painting a bleak picture of their current circumstances. Cliff said in an interview that the story of any given AAA game is key to its success, as a compelling narrative allows players to become emotionally invested in a diverse cast of characters. This focus on the characters' relationships was therefore essential to ensuring the game resonated emotionally with players. To that extent, the team made sure that the Locust would never be more than puppy-kicking villains, ensuring that players always recognized them as a clear embodiment of evil and didn't sympathize with their predicament. A lot of importance was placed on showing how the team had evolved into a tight-knit family since the fall of Jacinto, highlighting how everyone grew as individuals while dealing with their respective traumas. The exception was Marcus, who, just as established in Gears 2, was meant to remain the rock that players could rely on, someone who exuded an air of confidence. This consistency in his character would later be used to create a deeper emotional impact with the deaths of Dom and Adam, as well as in the ending monologue, which revealed the deeply rooted insecurities that the war had brought out in Marcus. This emotional maturity was also reflected in the addition of Anya and Sam as core members of the team, since the male characters were already too closely associated with being overly gung-ho about war in the eyes of the community. I mean, look at the main character of the game. Despite not wanting to be in the war anymore, Cole was never not ready to kill some grubs, which didn't exactly show his desire for more peaceful times. Anya and Sam, on the other hand, dealt directly with the heavier and more mature themes in the story. Anya became the emotional anchor Marcus came to rely on, while Sam's reaction to Dom's death showed how deeply the war had scarred even the strongest among them. Their inclusion also spoke to a growing part of the game's fanbase: women. As the series went on, more and more female players joined the community, and to avoid alienating them, the team made sure not to sexualize Anya or Sam. Visually, the team wanted to push things further as well. One of the biggest problems the studio had wasn't other games, but rather the nostalgia of their own community. According to Rod Ferguson, nostalgia caused people to remember Gears 1 to look better than it actually did, which even went so far as to make reviewers say that Gears 2 looked like Gears 1, and that wasn't even the worst of it. They'd heard the jokes about Gears being the Greys of war, or as I like to call it, designed to look like solidified shit and concrete. So, to address that, not only did they update UE3 on a daily basis so that they would never lag behind the latest HD visuals, but they also introduced Lightmass, a new Unreal Engine 3 lighting system featuring a global illumination renderer that produced more natural colors, improved shadow casting, and a directional lighting system ensuring that every character was properly integrated into each scene and cast realistic shadows for the time. The result was a world that looked more alive than ever before, showcasing a broader range of color palettes across vastly different areas of planet Sera, rather than the uniform concrete jungles the community had grown accustomed to. But that wasn't all. The team increased the light map resolution and had reworked every character model from the ground up, giving each one new, more distinct gear to help them stand apart visually from their previous counterparts. Chris Perna, the art director, later admitted he was slightly concerned the characters might have ended up too bulky, but overall the goal was achieved. The game looked sharper, clearer, and more vibrant, taking a few visual cues from the latest Halo release. Yet, Halo wasn't the only source of inspiration during development. Both Heavy Rain and BioShock influenced the decision to swap perspectives between characters such as the absolutely best character in the series, the Coal Train, allowing for more intricate story and richer atmosphere throughout the game. Because everything is made better with Augustus fucking Cole. These changes to the presentation of the story were made to encourage newcomers to jump into Gears of War 3 instead of the previous games, as the story was set up to act like a short story, a type of story that picks up in the middle of the plot and ends without a full resolution of every plot point. To make the game itself more appealing and to go in tandem with the theme of brothers to the end, which is so central to this game, the developers also added 4-player co-op to allow you and even more of your friends to go on this final journey together. This brought on a ton of balancing issues, as well as pacing, difficulty, and level design problems, but the team felt that for the end of the story, they should go all out. To accommodate the extra players, Epic Studios had to change up the levels, as Cliff Bleszinski bemoaned the fact that the areas in Gears 2 were too linear and thus didn't allow for a variety of approaches. So, they changed the areas in Gears 3 to allow for different strategies. Despite this, they didn't simply make the areas bigger, they instead made them even tighter but more open, so the path between your Lancer bayonet and the Locust chest cavity remains as unobstructed as possible to allow for different ways to approach. Even though this was to be the climax of the story, they didn't want to include as many set-piece moments as in Gears 2, since it took away from the game's replayability. So, instead they refocused on the basics of cover-based combat and allowing for more split routes that players can take. Up until now, you have only heard of how the team changed things for the players. So what about the enemies? Unlike the Locusts, who largely remained as they were in the previous games, with some changes, the Lambent were the true stars of the show. The Lambent have been a thing since Gears of War 1, but they were more in the background. Even in Gears 2, while the Lambent were now in open warfare against Locusts, they still only amounted to recolored drones and one that resembled your mom. In Gears 3, however, they were turned into a full-on faction with their own models and, more importantly, combat styles. This new Lambent faction was specifically designed to be able to handle 4 players at once, not only being able to target multiple people at the same time, but also dynamically changing their bodies to change how they behaved. These mutations weren't static ones either. To keep the players on their toes, the developers made sure that specific enemies have multiple various mutations. These could range from turning into a stationary turret to detaching from their body to become a slithering homing bomb. In general, the Lambent were balanced to overwhelm you. The Lambent stocks would keep spawning enemies, the Palps were created to rush the players and throw off their aim, and the Lambent Gunker was meant to act as heavy artillery, negating cover and forcing the player to focus in on it, opening them up to be attacked by other enemies. This focus to overwhelm the player was also made use of in the new and improved Horde mode, known as Horde 2.0. The main difference between this version and the previous version was the fact that the mode wasn't simply testing your positioning and tactical thinking anymore. This time around, the mode also introduced a currency that could be spent on acquiring new weapons, ammo, or defenses. These defenses could also be upgraded to make them even more effective and give them more health. That's right, now you needed to not only manage your personal ammo economy and figure out a safe position to hunker down in, but you also needed to repair damaged defenses or upgrade them to deal with ever-increasing numbers and variations of enemies. The team could have kept it at that already, and it would have been an amazingly fun mode in the state. However, they went the extra mile and decided to add Lambent enemies in this mode, which would engage Locust enemies in combat as well. At face value, one could say that this would make for cool 3-way battle moments, or that it made your job at surviving a bit easier, as the enemies would partially take care of each other. But this cleverly also presented you with yet another factor to think about. Enemies would be able to kill your enemies, who were your source of Horde mode currency. So leaving too many enemies to your other enemies would actually be a negative for you, adding another layer of urgency to an already hectic mode. But what if you were your enemy? What if instead of just being a cog soldier fighting Lambent and Locust, you could be one of them and fight the others? That is where Beast Mode comes in. You wouldn't be holding off a Horde this time around. No, you were the Horde. Beast Mode came to be out of an experiment in which a designer decided to let players possess Locust, and unexpectedly, the Locust controls were fully functional. This major new addition drastically changed the flow of gameplay. It was a class-based mode in which you had to choose classes that could work together, Cantus being healers, Maulers being tanks, and Retros being support, while units like the Savage Drone served as your baseline choice. With these units, you would assault a cog or stranded stronghold, fortified much like the ones you would fortify in Horde mode. However, this alone wasn't enough. Early on, the mode felt too similar to the arcade-like rhythm of Horde mode, so a crucial change was made. A countdown timer was introduced. You were placed on a 60-second clock that would only increase when you got kills or destroyed fortifications. This single design choice completely shifted the pacing, from hunt everything down to go for as long as you can. The round would end if you either killed all humans or ran out of time, forcing you to restart that wave. This new layer of urgency transformed Beast Mode into a score-driven challenge meant to push players not just to survive, but to compete with their friends on the leaderboards. But for those who weren't into PvE, the team also turned their attention to PvP. Over time, they felt their competitive modes had started to drift too far from what Gears was meant to be. Brutal, grounded, and intimate. To bring that identity back, they began consolidating and refining their modes. Capture the Leader became a perfect example of this consolidation process, merging elements of the old submission, or capture the flag, and VIP modes into something that felt more like Gears. PvP was also made more dynamic overall. To keep players engaged beyond the matches themselves, the developers introduced a calendar system, one that changed up the game in creative ways. From Ticker Tuesdays to Double XP Days and special campaign skins, these daily events gave players reasons to keep coming back. And with the addition of Team Deathmatch, dedicated servers, and a selection of weapons and rewards, the experience was kept fresh and mostly hiccup-free. But as rosy as this development timeline sounds, it was far from that. You see, Epic began development of Gears 3 almost immediately after Gears of War 2 was released, as mentioned before. Their plan was to release Gears 3 within 2 years, as Microsoft wanted Gears to not interfere with their marquee release, Halo Reach, which was meant to release in 2011. But as you can tell through a simple Google search, Halo Reach didn't release in 2011. That bitch released in 2010. So, what happened? Simple. As is tradition with Bungie by now, they done fucked it all up. Bungie, for reasons I did not research, moved up the release of Halo Reach by an entire year. This decision came so late into the development of Gears of War 3 that the game was essentially almost ready to be shipped out. So what is the problem? Just release both, right? Wrong. Releasing two big name games doesn't mean double the sales. It means the sales of both will go down. Which is why Microsoft told Epic Studios that Gears of War 3 would be delayed into 2011, and that decision was final. Hearing these news, Epic wasn't thrilled. Had they known, they could have built something much bigger instead of limiting their vision to make it possible to create something within 2 years. So now, with an almost finished game on their hands and way more time on the clock than they knew what to do with, Epic decided to hunker down and make sure the game would be a hit. Epic launched new multiplayer betas to test the different modes and iron out any kinks in the code, and to reach an even wider audience, if their previously mentioned Locust ARG didn't already capture the hearts of every last one of them. Because who wouldn't like to dig through rotten looking meat bought from Craigslist for hidden codes to an ARG? I couldn't think of a single person. It was in this meat-laden timeframe that they also started cross-promoting Gears 3 alongside a new game called Bulletstorm, which would provide customers with beta access codes which would be used to polish the game further up until the eventual release of the game on September 20th, 2011. So that was the story of how the game came to be. So how about we take a look at the story of the game itself? Almost 2 years after the events of Gears of War 2, in which COG forces managed to flood the Jacinto Plateau to stop not just the Locust Horde, but also the emerging Lambent threat, things were going absolutely horribly. Stuck on a giant ship that the surviving COG repurposed to become a mobile farm, Marcus and Dom are called up to defend against Lambent, which are being spawned by Lambent stalks sprouting out of the water. As it turns out, flooding humanity's last stronghold may have hurt the Locust, but it barely did anything to the Lambent. At the same time as the assault started, Chairman Prescott, the lanky guy from the beginning of Gears 2, appears again after having been believed to be dead. Along with him, he brings a suspiciously new-looking King Raven and an encoded message revealing that Marcus's father had been alive all this time. More importantly, however, is the fact that Marcus's father reveals that he is working on a weapon to surpass metal to beat the Locust and Lambent threat. Being unable to save the ship from the Lambent invasion, even with the aid of these new mini-walkers that make these thick ballerinas even thicker, Baird, Clayton Carmine, Sam, and the true main character of the series, the Coal Train, saved the day by blowing up the big-ass gummy worm snacking on the ship with tickers alongside the ship. Having lost their home and being informed by Cole and Baird that the locusts still yet exist, the team sets out to find Sergeant Hoffman, who, according to the now actually dead Prescott, holds the remaining info needed to find the location of Adam Phoenix, claiming that they're all stranded now. Heading towards Anvil Gate, the team encounters a locust encampment in which they spot a way to get to Anvil Gate a lot faster: the fart-powered gas barges. In the attempt to hijack one, they are discovered by Queen Mira herself, who uses that information to try her best to stop him from getting to his father. Managing to get on a barge, they fly towards Anvil Gate and find Dizzy on a supply run for Hoffman. Picking him up and squashing some grubs along the way, you arrive at Anvil Gate right on time to repel a locust attack and find out that Adam Phoenix is on an island surrounded by an artificial storm, which they would need a submarine for. Needing fuel to get the submarine going in the first place, they decide to source it from Mercy, Maria's hometown. Here they find nothing. No signs of life, no signs of combat, nothing. Except for doors that have been nailed shut, doors that were marked, bombs ready to explode if approached, and handprints. Long, elongated handprints covered in emulsion. An unnerving scene juxtaposed by the serene setting of Mercy that evokes images of the outbreak of the Black or Bubonic Plague, in which the same thing was done in infected settlements. Being shot at for disabling the bombs, a lone survivor wants the crew to fuck off so that he can stop it from spreading. Whatever it is. Unsure about what he is talking about, the team instead follows him to figure out what happened here, seeing more and more human handprints covered in emulsion, but now accompanied by huge sprays of blood. Finally catching up to the lone survivor, you realize the name no longer really applies, and Marcus, Dom, and the others head into the sewers to follow the tracks left by whatever killed the lone deader. Looking deeper, you not only find yet another survivor, but also a large amount of emulsion fumes. And as it turns out, the woman is not actually a woman, but a zooted woman. Zooted on emulsion. This marks the first documented instance of a human succumbing to lambency, and with it comes a revelation as catastrophic as it is damning. Humanity is no longer merely being hunted by the lambent. The very people struggling to survive can now be twisted, claimed, and remade by the very same parasite. The threat is no longer confined to the bodies of our enemies or the fumes of emulsion repositories. It is the beginning of a terrifying prospect. The enemy may have already won without even raising a hand. Being ambushed by hordes of lambent humans that reveal the sad truth of what happened to Mercy, the team fight their way to the central emulsion pipe and attempt to open it so they can fill up their tanker. Marcus, fumbling with the lever to open the valve, seems unable to move it, so Dom hands him his knife to help him out. Marcus then tries to give it back, but Dom just walks off. I'm sure he'll have more opportunities to get it back. This brief moment of peace sadly is not allowed to last, as the Lambent now attack Delta Squad full force, and to make things even worse, the Locust Horde also appears and cuts off Dom's escape route. Stuck between two overwhelming forces with no way out, Dom comes up with a plan on the spot and gets into their tanker and drives away. Marcus, not understanding, keeps fighting and screams after Dom, demanding to know what he is doing and where he is going. Dom refuses to tell him and turns the tanker around. Wrestling with his emotions, he floors it back towards the Locust and Lambent forces and demands that Marcus and the others get away. Cutting comms, Dom rams into the emulsion station and sets the entire area ablaze, saving the others while sacrificing himself. Having not only lost his brother, but also the fuel required for their journey to Azura, what remains of Delta Squad heads to Char, one of the many cities that were razed via Hammer of Dawn strikes during the beginning of the Locust War, in hopes to find fuel there. This entire section, the entirety of the Mercy chapter, is an absolutely amazing way to conclude Dom's amazing, albeit insanely depressing arc with an ending that pulled no punches and even made it worse, in a good way, by revealing Dom's regret at not being able to retrieve Maria's or their children's bodies and only living because Marcus still needs him to save the world. Mind you, not because he wants to save the world, because Marcus wants to. And let's not forget to mention that this is the chapter that had the honor of having Mad World be played in it, not just calling back to the one song that set the tone of Gears of War and made it stand out among other shooters, but also hammering home the loss of Dom's life. Char is now nothing but a charred husk of a city with only bandits still living there. Making a deal with these bandits, you get your fuel and head out to a location Daisy suspects to still hold a submarine. Fighting through yet another swarm of locusts, Delta Squad repairs the submarine and finally heads towards Azura, the island that they received the transmission from. Expecting the locusts to already be on Azura, they're proven right. However, what they did not expect is that the locusts are acting like Squidward in SpongeBob's place. They are here to build a new home base and not just defend the island for this operation. Delta Squad's goal is to destroy the device that is creating the artificial storm to allow Baird and Cole to invade the island. Not on their own, although I think Cole could 1v1 both the Lambent and the Locust, but alongside UIR, naval and scattered COG forces. Taking the device out, a final assault is launched not merely by the human faction, but also by the Lambent, who can now safely burrow their stalks through the island. However, still yet prevailing, Delta Squad manages to link up to Adam Phoenix and learn the truth about E-Day and the Lambent threat. As it turns out, the Lambency had always been a thing, and Queen Mira contacted Adam Phoenix near the end of the Pendulum Wars to aid her people in the fight against the parasitic emulsion. Having not been able to aid the Locust in time, Adam blames himself for E-Day, but vows to make up for it now, having altered the Lambent countermeasure to also target the Locust. Up on the roof of the tower the countermeasure is built upon, the team fights both Lambent and Locust, allowing Adam to ramp up the countermeasure. Having no other choice, Mira engages Delta Squad and the last of the Carmine brothers directly, but fails, allowing Adam to safely deploy the countermeasure. As a side note, Carmine showing up in a King Raven with a minigun and Leroy Jenkinsing it against Queen Mira is one of the most viscerally satisfying cutscenes ever, and the voice actor does an amazing job selling the hatred that Carmine holds for the woman that is behind the deaths of his brothers. It is just pure cinema. Pulsing waves sweep across the planet, causing Lambent to decay into pulps of now dead emulsion. The Locusts, which were created through emulsion-infected humans, also begin to collapse, essentially experiencing full organ failure at the cellular level, as emulsion has been in their system since the emergence of the Locust species. Assured of victory, the team prepares to get off the tower as the Tempest, Queen Mira's weird bug Locust mount, collapses on the tower and destabilizes it. But the pulses also begin to affect Adam. He reveals that he tested the countermeasure on himself because he had no test subjects and ended up deliberately infecting himself and even accelerating the parasite's growth so he could study it faster. With significant amounts of emulsion in his body, the countermeasure turns him into dust, crumbling into Marcus's hands. Adam's death once again breaks Marcus, with his voice going soft and the ever so resolute rock that he was designed to be breaking character, which makes sense in this moment. Mira, who is still yet alive, confronts Marcus and blames him for Adam's failure. Marcus, sick of her constant shit-flinging, ends her by stabbing her with Dom's knife, killing her instantly. With Mira dead and the countermeasure still pulsing, Lambent and Locust die en masse as the war has finally, truly ended. The team survived. Carmine, who was shot down in the final battle against Mira, has survived as well, and humanity celebrates the end of the long war. But Marcus, still crushed by the loss of both Dom and Adam, wonders what there is even left for them after all this. Anya reminds Marcus of Adam's last words, that Marcus should live for him, and that their sacrifice has given them a tomorrow. The story of Gears of War 3 is one of loss and uncertainty. It is made very clear that at this point, most if not all characters do not know how to live, truly live anymore. Every character here has lost everything. Not even the military structure that the COG gave the survivors remains, forcing them to look to the future and build something of their own making. This ending to the story and the original trilogy as a whole is sadly emblematic of what was to come for the Gears of War series. As with the arc's conclusion, Microsoft took some swings and nearly all of them were a miss. With Gears 3 being the climax of a trilogy that did not miss even once, it was clear that it would sell gangbusters, and it did not disappoint. In its first week, the game sold 3 million copies, making it the second most sold game in 2011, behind Madden NFL 12, which makes me so disappointed. Soon after launch, the game also reached over 3 million concurrent players at the same time, aided by the varied and bombastic campaign, as well as the new and improved multiplayer modes. In its entire lifetime, the game managed to boost the franchise sales to beyond $1 billion in revenue, making it part of an exceedingly exclusive list of franchises to be in. In fact, Gears was in such rare air that the only other game series to reach that milestone at the time was Halo, and Gears 3 specifically was lauded as a masterpiece in both gameplay and narrative with over 50 perfect scores. There was also a movie that was going to be made, but by the obvious Gears of War movie-shaped hole in the Gears lineup, you can probably ascertain the fate of that movie. It was sadly not the only project that never came to fruition. Long after the launch of the game, when asked about the future of the franchise, Cliff joked about being open to making some more creative Gears games that showed the world from other perspectives, such as a game entirely focused on the Carmine family. If the world of Gears wasn't already depressing enough, with these guys as our protagonists, man, a Carmine-based game would be the most traumatic game experience ever. It probably wouldn't have kept the general audience playing for too long either, as that was a genuine worry that the team had, as mentioned by Rod Ferguson, who went on record to say they had used some achievements for the DLC to sell more microtransactions and keep the players playing for a longer period, which stemmed partially from internal guidelines posed by Microsoft that postulated a 70% achievement completion rate on first playthrough for any of the games. Looking at the future of the series, one thing becomes very clear. Whatever the spark was that kept the original trilogy as one of the heaviest hitters in Xbox's history was no longer there, much like with many other Xbox IPs in the modern day. The first release after Gears of War 3 and its prequel DLC was Gears of War Judgment. Prior to researching this video, I had only heard that people do not speak of Gears Judgment, a game so bad that it was not worth speaking of. A game not developed by Epic Studios, but instead by People Can Fly, the same studio that ported Gears 1 to PC, or in more recent times, created 2021's Outriders. This game was a big departure for the series, as it swapped out its well-worn story structure for a more arcadey rapid-fire mission structure that would actively punish you for not engaging with the arcadey part of the game by keeping you from experiencing the Aftermath campaign, a section of the game that would take you back to the events of Gears of War 3, but this time show you what Baird and Cole were up to before the assault on Azura. It even drops the arcade aspects and instead goes back to the story structure. Besides this baffling decision, players also felt like the multiplayer was wholly incomplete, not even featuring all the modes that existed in prior games, being significantly diminished in the modes that were still present, and the game's balance not being the best either. And by the way, People Can Fly has also been announced to be assisting the Coalition, which is the studio that works on the modern Gears of War games, in the development of Gears of War E-Day. And speaking of the modern Gears of War games, Gears of War 4 was the equivalent of Star Wars The Force Awakens. It was careful to make sure that despite being a new cast, a new era, and a new studio, the longtime fans would not have to worry about Gears losing its identity. It wants to make so damn sure of it that the story itself is very, very slow, allowing the audience to get accustomed to this reimagined Sera. This was said to be one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses, with the general consensus being that it spent too much time trying to win the players over that it forgot to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and instead ended up being just the setup for its planned sequels. Another general consensus was the multiplayer having a severely troubled matchmaking system, with reports of long queue times that could actually never end and bugs galore. It was all in all a decent follow-up, however it also didn't stand out amongst its peers at the stage as it couldn't shake the multiplayer woes from dragging it down. I myself have not played it yet, this is what I have found from my research, but I will be playing it in the future. And speaking of being dragged down, Gears of War 5 also suffered from multiplayer issues, which were exacerbated by Gears 5 nickel and diming players for cosmetic items, or rather, multiplayer stuff in general, as the game was created as a live service game. However, not even the campaign was spared from the negative aspects of live service games, as it would also suffer from save issues and freezing. And while that may sound bad, people seem to have enjoyed the story of Gears 5 more this time around, even if some felt as if the change from one main character to another was rather jarring, and the decision to swap to an open world led to pacing problems. The only game that came after Gears 3 which was generally well received by both critics and the community seemed to have been Gears Tactics, with it being said to have a great conversion of Gears of War gameplay into a tactical turn-based format, good story, and being a well-made, mostly bug-free experience. That being said, if you look at the games that came after, it also seems as if Microsoft and the Coalition didn't quite know how to evolve the series from its roots. Every game that came after was significantly different in various ways. By itself, this decision is commendable, as it allowed Gears to experiment with new perspectives and could have led to them striking gold. However, as is the case with most Xbox/Microsoft games in the modern day that continue the legacy of an old IP, they feel directionless. They feel as if the developers are always on the cusp of a great idea but simply lack the leadership to truly realize it. This constant and slow bleed of the reputation of the series has led to Xbox taking a step back and looking at what has been missing from the Gears series that made the series an immediate standout. This reflection eventually led them to halting the story of the sequel trilogy and instead starting work on a prequel that would take the series back to where it all began with Gears of War E-Day. As a new fan of the series, the original trilogy has been a blast to experience and was so good that I want to experience Gears 4, 5 and Tactics at the very least, despite what I have heard. It makes me happy to hear that Xbox has not given up on the series and is working on a prequel to the original trilogy, which will hopefully give us more of that semi-horror feeling that the series has been discarding more and more ever since its inception. Gears of War is, in my opinion, a far superior series than other Microsoft juggernauts. Mainly Halo. I mean mainly Halo. And I want to believe that these issues that haunted the post-trilogy games were merely growing pains, that they were learned from, and that Gears can be as massive as the original trilogy made them again. So was it time for Gears to end with Gears 3? While it could have been a perfect sending off point for a perfectly written story, I feel as if it would have been a waste to bury a world with so many more stories waiting to be told. Everyone was wrong about Gears of War 4. Bold claim, I know, but it's true. Gears of War 4 was not a tone-deaf sequel that betrayed its fanbase. It was a sequel that dared to actually show the difference between the war-torn world that was before and a world that was about to find out that their time of peace was about to come to an end, making people feel like the game felt genuinely out of touch. So why is this claim just wrong? How does that not prove that Gears of War 4 betrayed its fanbase? With Gears Judgment being met with widespread criticism, Microsoft was a bit more apprehensive this time around. So much so that there was next to no information of Gears 4 prior to the E3 showcase in 2015, aside from the odd job listing and very guarded wording that only mentioned the future of Gears. This E3 reveal was meant to be a bombastic first look at the newest entry in the series to quickly generate a massive amount of hype. The showcase started off by announcing the remaster of the original Gears of War, and then quickly went on to a gameplay section of JD and Kate heading towards Fort Reval, chasing a Pouncer and looking at the totally randomized and totally always different wind flares. After this initial reveal, which had people tentatively excited, there was an avalanche of absolutely nothing. It wasn't until April 2016, almost an entire year after the E3 reveal, before something new would be released. The Tomorrow trailer. In this trailer, we essentially get a rerun of the E3 reveal, with our new protagonist JD fighting a Pouncer, but this time around the clips are regularly interrupted by his memories of his childhood, which officially confirmed that JD was the son of Anya Stroud and Marcus Phoenix. This trailer was then, shortly thereafter, followed up by a multiplayer beta. This beta was not actually a beta, but an alpha. However, Rod Ferguson stated people didn't know what it meant when they said alpha, so to make people understand what they were actually doing, they called it a beta. With this alpha test, the team mainly wanted to test the new back-end changes implemented in the game, such as new servers, telemetry, and matchmaking. Due to this alpha being, still an alpha, the graphics weren't the greatest, even though Gears 4 was set to show off the graphical might of the Xbox One. But because the team had to call it a beta to get people on board, everyone thought the game was further along than it was, and thus a lot of criticism was levied at the very rough look of it, even though it was never meant to be a graphical showcase at this stage. But it wasn't all bad. The alpha test allowed people to rank up as usual, and those who did would be granted multiplayer skins for the final release of the game, which got them a lot of positive word of mouth. And speaking of skins, ever wanted to change your skin? Well, Microsoft thought you might, so they created a small campaign to show off and fund this idea. Tattoos! This small campaign was led by a trailer called Gears Inc. In this trailer, people were invited to send in their favorite Gears of War moments from the past, and tattoo artist Steve Soto, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, would make you a custom tattoo of your choosing, as long as it was related to Gears of War, of course. The idea for this honestly really niche marketing campaign came from Gears fans historically being really avid tattoo enthusiasts who like to show off intricate tattoos, so Xbox decided to play into that. Between this and the next big event, there was essentially nothing except an Amazon promotion and a Snapchat face filter, and not even a particularly good one. Aside from that, you also had your run-of-the-mill energy drink and chips promos that gave you skins and whatever. But if you look at the marketing so far, and compared to the marketing for all of the 3 original games, it is quite barren in terms of things they did, and there isn't a lot more coming either. The next big thing that actually addressed the demographic that would usually be interested in video games was a hands-on session for Horde 3.0 at PAX, alongside a tournament called First to 50 with a name that could not be more self-explanatory if they tried, and the final real marketing thingy that is of any note was the promotion during the Formula Drift finale at Irwindale Speedway in 2016, in which Matt Field drove a car with massive Gears of War 4 decals on it. However, he wasn't the only one. Any and all of the other drivers could also apply a decal on their car, and the highest placing racers with the decal on their car would be gifted an Xbox One S and 2.5k didgeridoos. What a racing event would do to get eyes on Gears of War is beyond me, as I doubt there was much overlap with the general gaming audience. On the opposite end was the launch celebration livestream, in which a little bit of gameplay was shown off, alongside a giveaway that would award 90 people with the Gears of War 4 Ultimate Edition, allowing them to play a few days early. So if you look at this marketing run, there's a lot less here than any of the past releases. Hell, if you look at my previous Gears video, Please look at it. There was so much going on in every stage of the game's creation that this, by comparison, feels like a joke. There was so little there, in fact, that I was genuinely confused whether I was just bad at finding information or if there was actually just this little done for the game, and I'm still somewhat unsure about that. So, if there was actually more, put it in the comments, because what the hell happened? Well, as mentioned before, Gears of War Judgment was such a disastrous launch that Microsoft became scared of investing too much money into a project that may not give them a proper return of investment beyond just the development of the game itself. Gears of War 4's development did not actually begin with the Coalition, but rather started at Epic Studios, where it was in active development for 6 months. During this period, Tencent invested heavily into Epic Studios, directing them to shift their focus from console games to PC-based games. This major influx of money and sudden change in direction left Epic Studios uneasy, as it cast uncertainty over the future of the Gears of War franchise. To adapt to these evolving plans, Epic had developed an engine that was highly computer-centric and flexible, allowing them to modify their vision as development progressed. However, as if things could not get any more complicated, both Rod Ferguson and Cliff Bleszinski decided to leave Epic Studios to work on other things. Cliff Bleszinski took a break from game development altogether and then founded Bosky Productions, who developed Lawbreakers, and Rod Ferguson joined Irrational Games to work on BioShock Infinite. With their departure, the future of Gears was up in the air more than ever before, and this feeling of uncertainty would eventually culminate in the selling of the Gears of War IP to Microsoft. As mentioned before, Epic did work on the game for at least half a year, and created a first draft for the new enemy faction that the players would have to face. This new faction was called The Swarm. And if that sounds familiar, that is because this first idea was what the later games would continue to use. But this does not mean that the Swarm, as we know it today, was created by Epic Studios. As far as I could tell, only the name was kept, and most, if not everything else, was changed. What specifically was left behind, I could not find out. With the purchase of the Gears IP by Microsoft, they offered the IP to a studio called Black Tusk's. God, that's so hard to say with a German accent. Black Tusk Studios. While the opportunity to work on a series of such renown was definitely appealing to Black Tusk, they were already knee-deep in development for another IP that Microsoft was internally positioning as their new Halo. Mind you, Black Tusk was not forced to abandon that game, they were simply asked to think about it. Not wanting to lose an opportunity such as this, but also not wanting to simply can all the hard work they already invested in this new IP, Black Tusk leadership asked everyone in the studio to vote whether they should decline or not. With a majority decision, Black Tusk Studios opted to accept the offer of working on Gears of War 4 and cancel their previous IP. With this decision being made, they would henceforth be known as the Coalition. With the announcement of their name change, the announcement of a remaster for the original game, as well as a new entry in the series would follow. With Gears Judgment having been seen as an experiment to see what worked and, more importantly, what didn't work, the Coalition noted several things. 1. Long-distance combat did not feel good, and short to medium-distance combat was the sweet spot. 2. There were certain pillars of the experience that they needed to identify and focus on, such as how characters spoke and how they acted in a world that, to them, had always been at war. These pillars, amongst others, were to be used as jumping-off points to double down on or create foils for. Rod Ferguson at this point had also returned to aid studio manager Mike Crump in the development of this project. According to them, Gears 4 was not meant to be a system seller, but they still felt the pressure of having to live up to a legacy. This had them try to make an earnest game that would be able to stand on its own instead of simply trying to nostalgia bait the audience. But before any of this could be attempted, the newly formed Coalition had to recreate all the assets in Unreal Engine 4, as UE3 was no longer a valid option, given how Microsoft wanted them to show off the graphical power of the Xbox One. And given how these were no longer the same people who worked on the original trilogy, they also had to work on making the game feel like a Gears of War game instead of a generic shooter, which caused a lot of frustration within the development team. Not because they didn't want to put in the extra work, but rather because everyone was so excited about implementing the new ideas they came up with. One of these ideas was implementing SGX, a software that would automatically map characters' facial movements to the dialogue they were given. So, you know, automated lip flapping. According to an interview, the team had decided early on that macro-transactions, with an A, were going to be part of the game, including, but not limited to, loot boxes, remember those pests, which were divided up into PvE and PvE-only skins, separately sold character and weapon skins, maps, and a season pass. I wonder if they thought this would give people a sense of pride and accomplishment. Yet another thing the team wanted to do was to keep the player base together by reducing the amount of playlists and get more PvP players on board, and, if possible, competitive PvP players specifically. Creative director Chuck Osieja, I'm very sorry if I fucked that up, talked about how a big hurdle to getting more players into their multiplayer modes was that casual players from different shooters always complained about how much more difficult the PvP in any given game was compared to the PvE, and would not participate in the PvP because of that. In order to make the transition between the movement of PvE enemies and PvP enemies smoother, the Swarm Juvie was designed to mimic pro player movements so people would get used to the frantic movements of players in multiplayer. I won't go further into the PvP side of development because that part is usually not that interesting, and my birds have been chirping non-stop and I'm really fucking mad right now. A major change in the development process was the fact that, unlike the old games, which never set up a full story and wrote it as they went along, even going so far as to retcon previous details to make the story make sense. If you want to know more about that, check out my Gears of War 3 video. This newly planned trilogy had been fully written so that the team always knew where they would start from and where they would end up at. Kinda ironic given how the new story ended up being left unfinished. In an interview, Rod Ferguson claimed that to give their fans a new experience, one must betray them, but not to the degree that they feel like they are entirely disconnected from what is in front of them. Using that mentality, they came up with several ideas for the new game. One idea was to entirely redefine Marcus with a new look into his backstory, which would have retconned all of the original trilogy. Another idea was to set this new game either in a different timeline or a different planet, but as this would have disconnected the player with everything that had previously been established in Gears, this idea was thrown out. Yet another idea was to do prequels set during the Pendulum Wars, but as that would have meant a severe lack of human versus monster action, the team decided against it. And in my opinion, the funniest idea that the team tossed out was setting the new game during the beginning of the Locust War, because it would have forced them to tell a story with a predefined ending. And I mean, if you take a look at what the Coalition is doing now, I mean, it sounds like telling a story with a predefined ending seems to be the way to go. An interesting observation that the team made is that with Gears of War Judgment having had a different protagonist and not being connected to Marcus Phoenix whatsoever, the team mandated that the story had to connect to Marcus in some way, shape or form, as otherwise the game's reception would suffer. How they came to that conclusion is entirely beyond me, but who knows. With this new mandate in mind, they had one idea they decided to go with in the end. Have the games focus on Marcus's daughter, or Anya. Now, I can hear you say, but neither of those are in the game. And that is true. After coming up with the idea, they realized that Gears had a sense of masculinity to it, and not having a male protagonist would take some of that away. Again, if you look at what they did later, that is kind of funny. As Anya was at most a supporting character, she fell through as the new protagonist, so they went ahead with the protagonist being JD Phoenix. While writing the story of this entry, the team took inspiration from comics such as Batman and Old Man Logan. They wanted the feel of Gears of War 4 to be gritty, but not dry. Funny, but not comedic. This was most reflected in the character dialogue, where there was a clear disconnect between the new, young cast and the older cast. With JD, Kate and Del, who have never experienced even a single war, we have a group that is moving through life with a laissez-faire attitude and the associated quips that come from such a life. And on the other hand, we have the old guard, with mainly Marcus and Minister Jin, who look at everything with a more critical eye due to their past in the Pendulum and Locust Wars. To bring this vision of the characters to life, they needed to find the right voice actors to embody them. But getting the right voice actors was a bit of an issue. For Kate Diaz alone, the team was sent around 120 submissions in which they had to hone in more and more on the tone they wanted Kate to have, and eventually reached out to Laura Bailey, as the team wanted her to audition as well, even though she had previously already voiced a character in Ram's Shadow. Past the auditioning process for the new lineup of main characters, they found that the bigger issue was the voice actor chemistry. not because the voice actors didn't like each other, but rather because they liked each other too much, and would try to make each other laugh so much in between takes that it would disrupt the process. The VAs even had to be stopped due to the amount of disruptions caused by their shenanigans. Additionally, in that interview, Rod Ferguson claimed that nowadays, people wanted things to be a bit more complex, and not as clear-cut as good versus evil, like in the original trilogy. People wanted more gray areas, less heroes versus monsters. This was shown mainly in how the weird robot lady is trying to figure out what happened to the abducted humans, and is thus trying to go after our protagonists whom she suspects are behind the kidnappings. Seriously, what the fuck is that design though? And speaking of designs, lead campaign designer Matt Searcy explained that the team began by considering the specific roles each enemy should play. For example, the Pouncer was created to force players out of cover, making them more vulnerable to attacks and encouraging cooperation with your buddies. Similarly, the Juvies were designed to help players get accustomed to PvP combat, while also replacing classic fodder enemies like the Wretches. The designers couldn't stray too far from familiar territory though, they needed to cover the basics as well. So their updated version of classic enemies had to be distinct in how they fulfilled their roles, even if that main difference was in their animations. The team also had a major claim that I call bullshit on, which is them saying that the wind flares in the campaign would happen at random and would always be different. Yeah, no, they are scripted as hell. I don't even know why they said these would be randomized, like come on man. In the end, with the help of Rod Ferguson, who was known for striving to deliver on time, the game released without any delays, much to the surprise of Microslop CEO Satya Nadella, who was so surprised that he called for celebrations. So that was the story of how the game was made. Let's talk about the story of the game itself. With Gears 4 being essentially just a rerun of the first Gears game, but slower, you will find that not much actually happens. The story starts with flashbacks to various key events in the history of Sera, the first being the heist to get the Hammer of Dawn blueprints from the UIR, the second being shortly after E-Day, and the third being the final battle of the Locust War, with the Locust that fell starting to harden before we return back to the future, with Minister Jin giving us a speech. Here we switch to our actual protagonists, JD, Del and Kate, who are currently giving us a heavy-handed foreshadowing moment while invading a COG settlement to steal a fabricator to bring back to their town. Sadly, as with all heists, something goes wrong, and they have to deal with the robot police force protecting this area, in the end even having to face Minister Jin via the dumbest looking proxy robot ever designed, before swiftly escaping back to their small village and repelling yet another COG incursion. Out of nowhere, things go bump in the night and start abducting villagers with alarming ease, alongside Kate's mother, but not without giving our trio a hand. Trying to rescue Kate's mom, our team is off to find someone who can help them with this task. Arriving at the new Phoenix estate, JD, Del and Kate ask for Marcus's help, who wants to do nothing more than to berate JD for being a dipshit. Handing him the hand, Marcus quickly realizes what they're looking at and gets ready to help them out after all. Escaping the clankers all over again, the team tries to take shelter in an old fort and encounter the Swarm, locusts who evolved in crystalline cocoons and have now started to abduct humans to create more Swarm. Following that objective, a creature called the Snatcher DBNOs Marcus and slurps him up. Chasing the Snatcher down, the remaining three head into a mine that was repurposed into a locust burial site to find and free Marcus. Doing exactly that, Marcus reveals that the Swarm is a hive mind and that Kate's mother is being held somewhere else because unlike every other human, there seems to be something special about her. She is not like the other girls. Fighting their way back up to the top, they start following Marcus's lead to track down Kate's mom with the help of Baird and the former main character of the series, Uncle Cole. With two gigantic mech suits, the team now fights their way to yet another burial site and encounter a giant creature guarding the hive. With no build-up! Defeating the creature, the team gets to Kate's mom, but can't cut her down from her fleshy restraints, as doing so would immediately kill her. Demanding that they do it anyway to stop the Swarm, the game ends with Kate cutting her mom off from the Swarm tendrils and revealing a family heirloom with the old locust sigil on the back that for some reason is just not pointed out by anyone. Oh, I entirely forgot. The primary antagonist of this game, the Speaker, who is a Scion, which is like an evolved locust drone but more locust in nature than Swarm, he sure was. He died somewhere between them getting out of the mines and getting into the mech suits, but yeah, he sure was one of the enemies of all time. I personally thought, while the campaign wasn't anything too amazing, it wasn't as bad as I had been led to believe by the research I did for my Gears of War 3 video either. It was essentially just a rerun of the first Gears of War, but instead of trying to get the resonator to a specified position, you're now trying to get Reyna from a specified position. In that sense, it is pretty much like Star Wars Episode 7, which funnily enough also released within a year of this game coming out. As harmless as that sounds, it could also be quite disappointing who were hoping for more. Especially since the game doesn't start on a high note like the previous entries, which threw you right into the action mere moments after beginning. In Gears 4, the first few acts are slow and serve more to help the player get accustomed to this brave new world and its brave new cast of characters. Starting with a slow build-up unfortunately comes with major issues regarding expectations for encounters, since it had been at least 25 years since the last of the locusts roamed the planet in the games, and the creative director wanted this to be the dawn of the Swarm War and the larger conflict that had been brewing in secret. It wouldn't just suddenly escalate within a few days of the enemy getting things going. Even Emergence Day was brewing for years. However, because the idea that this would be the beginning of the war wasn't communicated in any meaningful way by their marketing, people were understandably disappointed when they found out that their main antagonists for the first two acts, at least, were robots. Robots that weren't even particularly interesting in their looks. Again, the fucking proxy design, what is that? An opinion I had read very often from reviews and discussions from the initial release period bemoaned the fact that the tone of this game was far too lighthearted for a Gears game, and to that I have to say that while I do understand where this criticism is coming from, as the series so far had always been about saving humanity from the brink of extinction, which of course made the entire tone quite grim, this was no longer the same setting, which in my opinion makes that criticism somewhat unfair. Sure, one could say, why change the setting in such a big manner then? Well, Gears of War 3 famously had the, quote, tie off all loose ends blue wave of doom, unquote, that tied off all loose ends and ended the threat. As of right now, these new characters had never been in the same situation as the old cast of characters. They never experienced the nearly 8-decade-long Pendulum Wars, nor the nearly 2-decade-long near-extinction level event that was the Locust and subsequently Lambent War. Their world was one of peace and quite literally no threats, with the exception of the wind flares that could cause some damage, but not so much that it would turn the entire setting grimdark again. And can we take a moment to appreciate the beauty of this northern Italian-inspired setting? This is genuinely chef's kiss, which then sadly gets ruined by the wind flares, but it's so good looking. The fact of the matter is that their characters being more lighthearted and quippy makes sense. They just don't have that baggage. And I do think that this change is actually a great setup for having the old cast clash with the new cast, as one can see with the resentment that characters like JD feel towards Marcus or vice versa. Mind you, I have not played Gears of War 5 yet, so I'm not quite sure if this will actually be paid off or not. This is just what I think at the moment. The enemy design is pretty damn great too. I love the variety of the models going further into the more animalistic designs rather than being mostly humanoids. It is also cool theorizing which locust creatures they could have evolved from, with the exception of the Swarmech. The Swarmech is admittedly really boring and a pain to fight because the guy will at times just shoot at your position and covers weak points. Oh, and then there's the speaker, who was also a bit of a nothing burger, but I mean, what can you expect when the highest rank in the new faction is the common soldier from the previous faction? Which I think is also a thing that the developers probably also realized. I mean, if you look at Gears of War 5 and what they bring to the table. Gears of War 4 released to approximately 617,000 sales in its launch week and is estimated to have reached around 4 million lifetime sales. I say estimated because it was around this time that Microsoft stopped publicizing their sales numbers. Critical reviews were generally favorable. Good, but not great. Many critics noted that the game did not tread any new ground, instead focusing on updating what was already there. A major pain point was the campaign, which was often described as just bland enough to be noticeable. Wow! This was attributed to the lack of a compelling antagonist, characters who tended to react rather than act, and a cast that lacked any defining traits, sometimes having that feeling enhanced by dialogue that critics found annoying. On the other hand, however, other critics found the dialogue to be genuinely charming, making the characters likable and showing a focus on a friendship that came to be in a post-war world. Where the game received near universal praise was its gameplay, which was widely considered to be an excellent recapturing of the feel of the original games. Creative enemy design and additions to the series' established cover-based combat were also said to improve upon the series' mechanics. The multiplayer modes, Port 3.0 and PvP, were also well received, despite being laden with bugs and connectivity issues during the launch period that held back otherwise positive impressions. So why am I just now talking about this middle of the way, both positive and negative view on the game by critics? Well, because the general audience reviews were far harsher, even though they were also still generally favorable. According to the average user, Gears of War 4 relied too much on nostalgia to get the person to buy the game instead of creating a truly new story, even if the new campaign offered a good external look at the COG and why one would oppose them even after the war. Both critics and players noted that the campaign had several missteps. Introducing the game by simply fighting robots felt like a misstep for longtime fans who were used to the over-the-top gore and visceral combat of previous entries. Many described the ending as abrupt, with little build-up and a final twist reveal that felt somewhat tacked on, leaving the narrative lacking the impact expected from the series. At the same time, some moments, such as the Horde defense sequences, did not feel fully integrated into the campaign, though they at least served as an introduction to the newly expanded Horde 3.0 mode. On the more positive side, Gears of War 4's graphics were widely praised, bringing the series' environments and characters to life like never before. I feel like they look a bit derpy when you look at them straight on. Dialogue and character interactions were a bit more split depending on what you liked. For some, it was genuinely charming and made the characters likable, while for others, it fell flat or was so annoying that it burned their consoles and PCs to the goddamn ground. A complaint that kept popping up was the overall lighter tone, which I would say stemmed from mismatched expectations due to the minimalist marketing not really representing this, but instead feeling as grim as the previous stories. The new cast was expected to be as stoic or serious as the original cast given the circumstances, but the game instead emphasized humor and friendship. In my opinion, the lashing that Gears of War 4 received feels unwarranted, as the events of the game marked the first in 2.5 decades in universe that a threat even remotely close to dangerous has emerged. People living in a world without any extinction-level threats, aside from the occasional freak weather events, would naturally be more lighthearted, with little to fear beyond the actions of their own governments. In the end, to me, it is very obvious that the harsh criticisms leveled at Gears of War 4 stemmed from vastly different expectations that Microslop isn't entirely without fault for. This wasn't a tone-deaf sequel that betrayed its fans. It merely tried to explore a world after nearly a century of war, a world that for the first time lived in relative peace, unless you count the threat of being blown away or being electrocuted. With the introduction of the new cast, Gears of War 4 is able to have a more nuanced tone that, alongside the excellently recaptured gameplay feel of the originals, was able to mostly pay its respect to its roots. The story may not have been the biggest thing since sliced bread, and the multiplayer may have suffered from major issues, but it set the stage for a new saga that felt familiar, but had the chance to be so much more. What a mess. That is the only way I can actually describe this game. When I started, I expected Gears of War 5 to be way better than I had been led to believe in the past, simply due to how much better Gears 4 was, at least to me, than one would have you believe. So Gears of War 5 must have been a lot better too, right? Well, it's complicated. Unlike my previous retrospectives, where I would go through the marketing, the development, the story, and then the reception of the game to really break down how everything came together and really tell as much of the story behind the game as I could find, this time around I feel as though it would be hard to really nail down the issues of the game and its creation if we don't first talk about the game itself and then go from there. Gears 5 launched on the 6th of September 2019. Published by Microsoft and developed by the Coalition, the game was off to an impressive start, with 3 million units sold within the first week, rivaling Halo 4. Reviews by critics were generally favorable, being happy with just about everything except for the story and lack of innovation with the game's systems. And that is kind of the entire problem with the game. See, when it comes to the PvP and co-op modes, nothing really but the gameplay matters, so the story and lack of innovation there isn't too big of an issue. But the main thing that makes these games so memorable is the story, and that one just did not deliver, which is really confusing as the game, at times, manages to show its excellent storytelling. But let me back up for a moment. So, to refresh your memory, or for those who may have never played Gears 5, the story picks up just about immediately after the end of Gears of War 4. Realizing that shit well and truly is fucked, Minister Jin buries the Lancer and aids the newly reformed Delta Squad consisting of Marcus, Kate, Del and JD in defending against the oncoming swarm threat. However, in true Phoenix fashion, Delta does their own thing and attempt to reactivate the Hammer of Dawn satellites. Launching one of them, they head back only to find out that they still cannot reactivate the Hammer array due to a lack of connecting satellites. Having been found out by Jin, the team is ordered to cease the reactivation of the Hammers. Before the discussion goes any further, however, Delta is sent to aid Settlement 2, which is currently under swarm attack. Deploying with a former squadmate, Faz, aka Dickhead, and the first half of Baird's replacement, Del and Kate find out that JD once ordered his squad to shoot civilians, which causes the relationship between the new trio to fracture, and finally giving us a reason as to why JD went outsider in the first place. Yet again, before the discussion can go any further, the swarm invasion intensifies, and JD orders the one hammer that they recovered to strike, despite repeated attempts by Baird to tell him that this will go wrong. Lo and behold, things go wrong, and we sadly have to add yet another Carmine to the tally alongside JD's hairline and right arm. Blasting right past any and all character development that JD may have gone through, we fast forward 4 months to Kate trying to recruit a camp of outsiders led by her uncle. Here, after yet another swarm incursion, Kate somehow takes control of swarm units and kills her uncle right before JD and Faz come in to drive off the remaining enemy forces. Trying to uncover how she's connected to the swarm, Kate leaves to find answers and eventually finds them in a secret lab underneath Mount Kadar. Here they find Niles, the New Hope AI from Gears 2, as an AI construct who conveniently exposition dumps all the info about the origin of the Locust to us to explain in no uncertain terms that Kate is going to be the next queen of the Locust. Well, the Swarm. Demanding he severs her connection to the Swarm, Kate learns that her mother is somehow still technically alive through a connection made via the Matriarch, the first Berserker to have ever been created. Realizing that Niles is trying to use Kate somehow, they cut the connection and try to hunt him down. Clanker being a clanker, Niles fights dirty and unleashes Deep Frozen Locust. You know, the one species that was canonically eradicated at the end of the 3rd game, and the remainders hunted down in the books. Yeah, somehow the Locusts have returned, 'cause that makes any sense. Fighting your way through these, you finally get to Niles, only to have him killed by the Matriarch, which you then quickly dispatch as well. Now knowing of the looming threat, Kate wants to reactivate more hammers to prepare for what is coming and heads to Vaskar, a previously UIR-occupied region which still seemed to hold intact Hammer of Dawn satellites, which they decide to launch due to being told that the swarm has become more organized than ever before. Fending off the Eurosaur Riftworm, the team manages to launch the satellites and return to New Ephyra and try to figure out where the swarm may have its main hive, right at the same time as when the swarm decided to launch an attack on the city, with the new queen fully revealing herself and forcing you to decide whether JD lives or Del dies. Because, let's be honest, Del was such a lackluster character, you didn't even notice I stopped mentioning him past the beginning of this recap. Having killed off the second half of Baird's replacement, the remaining team members fend off the swarm invasion with the help of the Hammer of Dawn and end the game by essentially charring New Ephyra. So now that we have a general base, let's get into the issues that stem from the story itself, as this aspect was the most brought up issue among everyone who reviewed the game, alongside how samey it felt, even though there have been major changes introduced into the campaign, such as the semi-open world. Hey, Hawks from the future here. I just wanted to make sure one thing still came across. This is a fun game. I enjoyed my time playing it a lot. And if it had been, a standalone game, I think this would have been an amazing experience, but it is not a standalone game, and thus it sadly has to be compared to its predecessors. In what follows, I will sound very negative, so I wanted to make sure I make it clear before we continue. This is a fun game, and I do believe it is actually worth your time if you can look past the flaws in the story. Alright, back to the video. And why don't we start with that? A semi-open world was said to ruin the pacing of the story time and time again, given the stakes established by providing an empty, flat, and mostly uninteresting world that only rarely managed to break up the monotony via miniature combat scenarios, which essentially only existed to make the jack grind even the slightest bit exciting. If the game didn't decide to disconnect you in the middle of a play session due to it being a live service game, or if the skiff didn't randomly become inaccessible because it decided to clip through the ground. Mind you, this game was released in 2019, at the absolute height of the live service game spam. One would have expected they would learn from the mistakes of their competitors and, work on the connection, or at the very least the geo of the entire map. Now, the open world aspect really didn't help the game, and it felt as if the open world was something that was being enforced by Microsoft management due to the trends at the time, instead of being a decision that was made by TC themselves. But we know that to not be true. This decision was explicitly made by the coalition to, and I quote, make the series their own, end quote, after having tried to prove themselves by attempting to show that they could make a proper Gears of War game with Gears of War 4, a task that I believe they actually succeeded at. However, by trying to make the series their own, they actually managed to dilute the entire experience, despite saying that the introduction of the skiff, Jack's upgrades, and the semi-open world were there to push the series forward. Not only were people already saturated with live services, but better, more polished ones at that. Ones that didn't stall the game with empty yawning spaces. How these aspects were meant to, quote, push the game forward, instead of taking away from the much more intricate urban settings, on-the-rails linear corridors, and tighter writing that the series is known for, I cannot imagine. It didn't really heighten the game by any notable degree either. And sadly, the same goes for the story of the game. It is actually insulting how many times the story had a great setup to get us to know these characters more, only for these opportunities to be shut down as hard as Concord was. Remember how in the last game, the main complaint was that the story was too slow? It seems as though the writers overcompensated this time around, skipping over entire story arcs and hand-waving explanations for the sake of brevity. As mentioned before, JD post-Baldening just does not get character development at all. Any and all changes were just off-screen for some reason, removing the opportunity to get to know a character the audience was already invested in more. We aren't even allowed to see how these events changed him, and just swap to a different character due to the team deciding that watching someone go through something wouldn't be as impactful as going through it yourself, which would be a good point if it wasn't for the fact that they did that to JD himself, and that Kate's entire arc ends extremely early into the game with the death of the matriarch. That's just exceptionally baffling given how the marketing was centered around Kate, with 3 trailers that showed her trying to understand and overcome her connection to the swarm, and Kate Diaz themed vans. They even made shoes meant to be inspired by her, only to kick her plot to the curb. This is insane! The new psychological aspect that was introduced by these trailers and that the game wanted to focus on is just unceremoniously removed, and the plot goes back to external struggles, almost as if the writers didn't know where to go with it. You put her on vans, you can't just back out like that! The connection to the swarm that Kate had could have been used for some great storytelling, or at the very least, some cool gimmick missions in which you maybe tried to collect some info on the swarm while trying not to act sus as a swarm unit controlled by Kate, or exploring Kate's psyche more. But instead, this entire idea was just seemingly there to kill off Oscar, which didn't even impact the story that much. But at the same time, it got rid of Oscar, which I personally am a fan of because god, he just sucked in the last game. But just like most other ideas in the game, he felt like he could have had potential. Potential as a faction leader opposed to both the Swarm and the Cog. But his death didn't even change Kate in any way. She didn't get more reckless or anything. If anything, it felt like even the writing team forgot about Oscar a mission or two after. Kate being the next queen in line, a plot thread that was set up throughout Gears 4 as well as Acts 1 and 2 of Gears 5, gets abruptly cut short thanks to Niles' exposition dumping and then dying immediately. It is such a baffling decision. His return felt completely unnecessary. He was just there to explain how Kate was connected to everything, in not even an interesting way. He just dumped it all at once. I can't believe they actually thought that was the right way to handle it. But whatever. What is not whatever is the lore-breaking retcon of there still being Locust. As mentioned in my prior video, the blue wave of doom that was meant to tie off all loose ends was meant to tie off all loose ends! You cannot say that some locusts still get to exist just because they're frozen. If there was a reason for that in the books, reiterate it in the game. Not everyone reads the books. I haven't even once heard of a single thing about the locusts still existing past the picking off of survivors in one of the books. And even then, why are they still locusts? Gears of War 4 established that the previously killed locust actually just got cocooned. Why were these locusts not cocooned? Rather than actually contributing meaningfully to the story, like the revisit to Azura in the beginning of the story, this just felt like nostalgia bait. Gears of War 5, in general, was really just a huge amount of nostalgia bait. It didn't feel like the references to older games were placed there to enhance the story in any way, but instead simply to get people to do the Wojak pointing meme whenever something from the old games was mentioned or brought up. This was most blatant, with the Locust just somehow returning, even though they should have been Sludge and Paddock, who was from Gears Judgment and was hinted at to be an old friend of Baird's, but again, no effort was made to acquaint him with a new audience. It makes sense not to do that when the characters have been a series mainstay, like Marcus, Cole, or Baird, because reintroducing the characters constantly would be stupid. But Paddock was from a spin-off game, one that was not well regarded at all. These issues, among quite a few others, however, are issues that would remain contained within Gears 5 and wouldn't have carried over to Gears 6. You know what would have carried over? The decision you made of who lived and died at the end. Not only did that decision feel like a vain attempt to recapture the emotional weight of Dom's death, but it isn't even set up in such a way that it could reach the emotional highs of that moment. The choice between JD and Del felt shoved in? Like, JD has an actually interesting character that has evolved since his introduction. Meanwhile, Del just remained the nerdy, smart, jokey friend stereotype. Even fucking Faz had more character development than Del. He was more interesting to keep around than Del because for some reason the coalition decided to split the character of Baird into two characters but only gave one of them an iota of the character arc that Baird went on. So with one of them now dead, what happens in future games? Will the team write entirely separate narratives to accommodate the choice? Which would be genuinely impressive. Maybe they will only change the dialogue that is spoken in the next game, completely removing any agency the characters could have, as they cannot be allowed to do anything that the other character would have done, as that would be out of character. Or will they just decide on one canon going forward, completely voiding the impact of the choice? They kind of just wrote themselves into a corner with that one, and I don't know how they would get out of that without leaving at least some of the players miffed that their choice was disregarded in some way. You might say that this isn't a big problem, but The Coalition said that Gears 5 was not going to be the middle game in a new trilogy. In fact, it sounded more like they had an enormous plan for an expansive arc because they wanted character development to be a slow burn and have them not be stereotypes, which, by the way, they failed at given how Del, Faz, Kate, and even JD were all stereotypes. And let's not even get into the claim of their story being intentionally written to have loose ends, which they called negative spaces that would not be explained whatsoever. As in, not even in the sequel. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds like they realized they have plot holes and tried to do the broken window band-aid meme, with the band-aid being negative spaces. But in all honesty, it wasn't all that bad either, despite what my previous tirade would have you believe. For one, the theme of repeating the mistakes of the past was an interesting, well-executed concept that showed the hubris of a cast that didn't know the horrors of all-out war and weren't learning from their history. Or, at the very least, were taking the wrong lessons from history. And while I feel like this should have been explored a bit more, I was fine with how this theme was handled and persisted throughout the entire game. What with the relaunching of WMDs, the authoritarian way the COG was dealing with dissent and not taking genuine threats seriously. Hell, the varied biomes of the open world do look striking, even if they are just mostly empty plains. The Hivebusters DLC does an especially amazing job at this. Jack's upgrades do allow for some genuinely fun combat adaptation, such as using the shock trap to dispatch Juvies via a choke point so it can focus on other enemies. The narrative not simply discarding the old cast, but rather placing them all in important positions in the story, makes them all still feel respected in a way that makes sense in the story. Even contributing to the earlier mentioned theme of repeating past mistakes, which they constantly warn you about. And the city sections, alongside Sera, are genuinely amazing chapters, with the Invasion of Settlement 2 being one of my favorite sections in the entire game by far, in part because of the destruction that the Swarm causes alongside the Hammer of Dawn. Fun fact, according to Rod Ferguson, the Hammer of Dawn reactivating and widespread destruction are always signs of the game and the story launching into a full-blown war for the foreseeable future. This is apparently such a popular idea within the team that they constantly brainstorm ideas to destroy the planet in more creative ways, and it became a recurring concern how they could justify more environmental destruction in a way that fits the narrative. It is silly stuff like this that you can actually tangibly feel in the game, as the sections with widespread destruction are usually some of the most fun and memorable parts. That was also in part because of how genuinely amazing Gears 5 looks. The jump in graphics between Gears 4 and 5 is insane, and to this day looks better than most games that released after it. Like, have you seen the lighting in this game? It feels like a shame that most of the time you focus more on killing the enemies because of how amazing everything looks. Some horror games should take notes from that intro section because holy fuck, that dark corridor is... God, I cannot even put it into words. With Gears 4, Xbox wanted to use it to show off how good graphics could get on the Xbox. And in my opinion, I mean, in comparison to this, which also was meant to show off the graphical might of the Xbox, yeah, it isn't even close. Art director Colin Penty claimed that this was achieved by investing a lot into CPU bottleneck optimization and making use of every single post-processing effect possible in UE4. As I don't want to spend yet another 3 months on a single video and have YouTube punish me for trying to make a well-edited video again, you can find the details of the optimization now on screen, as well as the myriad of technical changes, which you can find linked in the description. And speaking of technical changes, see those health bars above their heads? Why are they there? They don't add anything to the gameplay and look weird in an otherwise very clean HUD. My guess is that they were added because all live service games had them back then, and no further thought was given to it because there's no reason to have it. I can't help but wonder if this was something that came about before or after those internal playtests held 2 years before launch. The ones where they focused on finding bugs and tightening up the story. Tightening up the story? The story was once even more of a mess than this? What the fuck? Aside from that genuinely unbelievable claim, the playtests were also used to refine the encounters, which were mainly upped in difficulty across the board, with each encounter sitting in that sweet spot between easy and overwhelming. This rebalancing was meant to push players out of their comfort zones and allow them to feel accomplished after beating them, even if it took a few deaths. To alleviate the rise in difficulty, which was achieved by making the enemy AI smarter, allowing them to pull off flanking maneuvers or suppressing you while their shotgun buddies just blasted you into oblivion, the team wanted Jack to give options to the player to disrupt enemy strategies with his special abilities. Oh, they also apparently retuned the feel of every gun, which was meant to make the PvP feel more responsive. This reminds me, I have yet to talk about PvP in this video. PvP still is a thing. Alright, that concludes the PvP section of this video. Let's get to talking about how the game was received, which I don't think I really need to make a huge secret. This game was torn to shreds by non-critics. But before getting to the ass blasting, let's actually look at what people did like about it. As mentioned in the intro, Gears 5 was one of the best-selling games for Xbox since Halo 4. The set pieces helped the game stand out amongst its peers, even if it was only by so much. It looked amazing and had accessibility in mind during every step of the development process, even going so far as to have entire development phases dedicated to ensuring that the game would release with as many accessibility options as possible. And finally, the vast representation of different cultures on Sera not only added a lot of depth to the world itself, but was also lauded as something that allowed people in real life to identify with the characters, and the newly added escape mode was also a ton of hectic fun, being helped by the large player pool thanks to Gears 5 having been a day 1 Game Pass release. Sadly, this already concludes the praise that the game got. As spread throughout the first half of this video, the story felt not well thought out despite it being fun to play. Plot points were dropped, set up, and ended in such a rapid pace that nothing really felt satisfactory, which bafflingly was a goal for the team, as they wanted every major event in this game to only be a setup for future games, entirely ignoring the fact that the story of this game had to also have some conclusions. The live service nature of Gears 5 and the need to make money for each Game Pass player that didn't fully buy the game led to it being genuinely over-monetized, with some community-made graphics adding up the total cost of every microtransaction to around 750 didgeridoos. Skins, for example, were sold for about 10 euros each. Sure, they could also be earned, but players complained that their earn rate for iron, which was the in-game currency, was abysmally slow. Yet other players pointed out that due to the heavy monetization present in the game, they got less content for the same amount of money as previous games, which Rod Ferguson rejected, stating that there was more content there, they just had to play the daily and weekly objectives to get them. This obviously didn't sit well with the community, as they didn't want to be told which game mode to play, and beyond that, heavily disliked the time-limited battle passes that were clearly meant to drive player retention through FOMO. This funneling of players into specific modes made them even more annoyed due to the game launching in a genuinely unplayable state with infinite load screens, prompts to interact with things not appearing, and constant disconnects even in the campaign, which, remember, was also always online. But the worst part was that not only was the team incredibly slow to respond to complaints, but they also seemed completely disconnected from what the community wanted, rolling out tone-deaf collaborations like the Terminator crossover and promoting the game with creators like Ninja instead of long-standing Gears creators. It really felt like they didn't understand what the fanbase was looking for in a Gears game. I usually don't like to end videos on such negative notes, but this game genuinely made it hard not to be negative. While the previous games were all fun in a way that always pushed the negatives to the side, this time, despite the game being a ton of fun, it simply feels too mired in its problems to just look past them. Gears 5 reminds me a lot of the dumpster fire that was The Last Jedi to Gears of War 4's The Force Awakens. I am, however, hopeful that the team has taken all the feedback they have gotten and will use it to make Gears of War E-Day the best it can possibly be.